Find somewhere comfortable. Pull a blanket over yourself if you have one nearby. We're going to spend the next few hours wandering through one of the most intricate, haunting, and deeply human fictional universes ever built for a video game. You don't need to be a Fallout expert to follow along. Everything you need to know will be here, laid out slowly, piece by piece, like notes spread across a cluttered desk in an abandoned office somewhere in the wasteland. Fallout is a series of post-apocalyptic role-playing games that began in 1997, and what sets it apart from nearly every other fictional universe of its kind is how much it cares about the world that existed before the apocalypse. Most stories set after the end of civilization treat the old world as a blank canvas, a backdrop that justifies the survival mechanics and the drama without asking too many questions. Fallout does something different. It asks questions constantly. It puts old newspapers in filing cabinets that were never supposed to be opened. It puts diary entries on holotapes inside vaults that no one survived. It scatters the wreckage of a specific civilization across every corner of its irradiated landscape, and then it lets you find those pieces one at a time, at whatever pace you choose. The world of Fallout is built around a concept that the developers call retrofuturism. The idea is that sometime around the 1950s, the cultural and technological trajectory of the United States diverged from our own reality. The optimism of the post-war era, that shining belief in science and progress and the American way of life, never really faded. It calcified instead into something harder and stranger. Nuclear energy became the dominant fuel source. Computers evolved but retained the aesthetic of enormous reel-to-reel machines and vacuum tubes. Robots were built to look like something out of a diner on Route 66. And the cultural attitude of the country remained frozen in a kind of permanent 1950s chrome and neon confidence, even as the geopolitical situation grew increasingly dire. What makes this setting so effective is the contrast it creates. You walk through a bombed-out city and find a child's coloring book lying open on the floor, the crayon drawings still bright, the cheerful cartoon characters on its cover smiling up at the sky. You turn on a radio and hear a crooning singer performing "I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire" from 1941, a song about love and modesty that became one of the most haunting soundtracks to global annihilation ever assembled. The gap between the world these people thought they were building and the world they actually left behind is where most of Fallout's emotional weight lives. But there is actual history in this world, and it matters. The decades leading up to the Great War, which is what the Fallout universe calls its nuclear apocalypse, were defined by one resource above all others: oil. The resource wars, as they came to be known, began around 2052 when the Middle East finally ran dry, their petroleum reserves exhausted after a century of exploitation. The United Nations dissolved shortly after, having failed to resolve the conflict between member states. Europe began fighting over the remaining oil fields in the Middle East. China began pushing into the former Soviet territories. And the United States, hungry and increasingly aggressive, went to war with China over the Alaskan oil pipeline. That war over Alaska was called Operation Anchorage, and it became one of the defining military campaigns of the pre-war era. American soldiers fought Chinese invaders in the frozen tundra, holding the pipeline against overwhelming odds. The soldiers who survived became legends. Power armor, those enormous mechanized suits that are one of the most iconic images of the Fallout universe, was developed partly in response to the brutal conditions of that Alaskan campaign. A 6-foot slab of pre-war military engineering, these suits turned a human soldier into something closer to a walking tank. They ran on fusion cores. They could stop a .50 caliber round. And they gave the United States military an edge that China, for all its numbers and determination, struggled to overcome. The Sino-American War, as the conflict came to be called, dragged on for years. China's conventional military campaigns kept failing against American power armor and technology. And while soldiers died in the cold and the mud, the people back home were told it was going okay. The government controlled information. Propaganda was sophisticated. Posters on walls showed cheerful images of the American way of life, persisting against all threats. Children played with action figures of soldiers in power armor. Breakfast cereal boxes featured Pip-Boy, the cheerful cartoon mascot of Vault-Tec's personal information processors, smiling his round green smile at whoever poured the milk. And Vault-Tec was building the vaults. This is where the story begins to darken in ways that most people don't fully appreciate until they've spent time in the games. Vault-Tec Corporation was the company the United States government contracted to build a network of underground survival bunkers, massive reinforced concrete habitats buried beneath the ground where civilians could wait out a nuclear war in relative safety. The official project was called Project Safe House, and by 2063, 122 vaults had been completed across the continental United States, with the last two, Vaults 13 and 112, finished by 2074, 3 years before the bombs fell. The official story was that these vaults would protect humanity from nuclear annihilation and allow civilization to rebuild. If the worst happened, vault residents would emerge after a generation or two, once the surface was safe, and start again. That was what the brochures said. That was what Vault-Tec's representatives told the families who signed up, who moved their possessions into the gleaming underground corridors with their turquoise and yellow color schemes and their cheerful Pip-Boy murals on the walls. What Vault-Tec was actually doing was something considerably more sinister, and it forms one of the series' most persistent and layered mysteries. We'll come back to the vaults in their own section, because they deserve the full weight of that conversation. But for now, understand that the world of Fallout spent its final decades building elaborate structures that were marketed as salvation, but designed for something else entirely. The Great War itself happened on October 23, 2077. In the span of roughly 2 hours, nuclear warheads fell on every major city in the United States and most of the Western world. The exchange was mutual. When it was over, the surface of the Earth was fundamentally altered. Cities were craters. The sky changed color. Most plants died. Most animals died. The people who weren't killed outright by the blasts were killed in the days and weeks that followed, by radiation sickness, by the collapse of infrastructure, by starvation. Some people survived in the vaults. Some survived on the surface, exposed to radiation and forced to adapt in ways that reshaped them physically over generations. Some survived in places sheltered enough that the worst of the fallout passed over them, and they rebuilt small communities from whatever was left. What came after, the centuries between 2077 and the present day of the games, is what the series calls the post-apocalypse. But that word, post-apocalypse, makes it sound finished. Like the crisis is over and what remains is just cleanup. What the Fallout games understand, and what makes them genuinely fascinating to spend time in, is that the apocalypse never really ended. It just changed shape. The bombs stopped falling. But everything the bombs made possible, the power vacuums, the mutations, the desperation, the factions fighting over scraps of the old world's authority, all of that kept going. Keeps going. The Commonwealth, the Capital Wasteland, the Mojave Desert, Appalachia. These places are not the aftermath of a disaster. They are the disaster, still happening, viewed from a different angle. And wandering through them, reading the notes people left behind and listening to the radio stations still broadcasting into the silent air is one of the most quietly affecting experiences in gaming. Because every piece of wreckage was once something. Every collapsed building was once someone's home. Every skeleton slumped in a corner was once someone who had hopes and plans and people they loved. That is what we are walking through for the next few hours. The wreckage of a world and all the mysteries it left behind. Before we go further, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always something to scroll through and see someone watching from across the globe at 3 in the morning or a Sunday afternoon. And if you haven't already, a subscription means these long videos keep coming. Section 2. The Great War Mystery. Who actually dropped the first bomb? There is a question that sits at the very center of the Fallout universe. The kind of question that, once you notice it, makes you wonder why you never thought to ask it before. If two countries point nuclear weapons at each other for long enough, someone eventually pulls the trigger. In the real world, we talk about deterrence, about mutually assured destruction, about the logical stalemate that prevents either side from acting first, because acting first means dying right alongside your enemy. For decades, this logic held in the Fallout universe just as it held in ours. The United States and China stared at each other across the Pacific, each with enough nuclear warheads to end the planet, and neither one moved. And then something moved. On October 23, 2077, the first missiles were launched. Within 2 hours, civilization as it existed was gone. The question that haunted fans for nearly 3 decades of the series was devastatingly simple. Who launched first? The games never definitively answered it for the longest time. Tim Kaine, the man who co-created the original Fallout game back in 1997, has spoken about this at length. Early in the franchise's history, Kaine's position was essentially that the answer didn't matter. The result was the same regardless. Two superpowers pointed weapons at each other, and the weapons were eventually used. Whether America fired first or China fired first, the outcome was identical rubble and silence. The horror of mutually assured destruction isn't about who started it. The horror is that starting it and being destroyed by it are the same event. But as the series grew and the lore deepened and the fan community spent years sifting through every terminal entry and holotape and loading screen, the question kept resurfacing. And in 2023, Tim Kaine finally gave a real answer during an interview with the Fallout-focused YouTuber TK's Mantis. The two spoke for an extended period about the history of the franchise. And near the end of that conversation, Kaine addressed the Great War with more specificity than he ever had before. His answer was that China launched first. But the reason was what made it interesting. It wasn't purely about oil or territorial aggression or some calculated military strategy. It was about the forced evolutionary virus, the FEV. China had discovered that the United States was conducting illegal biological weapons research using this virus, a pathogen of extraordinary power that the U.S. government had developed at Mariposa Military Base in California. The international agreements of the pre-war era had designated biological weapons as prohibited. When China found out what America was doing, it demanded the program be stopped. The United States agreed publicly, then continued the research in a different location. China eventually discovered the deception, and that discovery, according to Kaine, was the thing that broke the stalemate. It was the final piece of information that convinced whoever needed convincing in Beijing that a first strike was the only remaining option. This is, when you sit with it, a tragic and deeply human explanation for the end of the world. It is not some grand geopolitical calculation about oil reserves or territorial expansion or ideological supremacy. It is a story about a secret kept badly, a lie told to the wrong people, and a chain of trust that finally snapped under the weight of too many violations. America was afraid of losing, so it cheated. China found out, and then everyone lost everything. The games themselves contain clues that support this reading. In Fallout 3, if you explore Fort Independence, there are terminal entries describing Chinese bombers being detected first, the radar screens filling with incoming aircraft before any American launch was confirmed. The military logs describe a chaotic scramble, a frantic attempt to understand what was happening before the warheads hit. It reads like the shock of someone who expected the stalemate to hold for another day, just one more day, and discovered at the last possible moment that it hadn't. But then came the Fallout television series in 2024, and it complicated everything. The Amazon Prime show, which was broadly praised for its production quality and its understanding of the franchise's tone, answered the same question in its season finale. And its answer was neither China nor the United States. According to the show, it was Vault Tech. The revelation unfolds across the season, with the show depicting a secret meeting of the most powerful pre-war corporate executives, Vault Tech, Robco Industries, General Atomics, and several others, gathered to discuss what would happen after the war. Not if the war came, after it. Because they were operating on the assumption that the war was inevitable, and their discussion was about who would be positioned to control what remained when it was over. The show implies, and in its finale makes as close to explicit as it can manage without showing someone actually pressing a button, that Vault Tech's leadership made the decision to launch first because peace would have been bad for business. The vaults were built. The investments were made. The experiments were designed. The entire structure of their post-war power depended on there being a post-war. This created an enormous conversation among fans because it directly contradicted what Tim Kaine had said a year earlier. The show's producers addressed this by noting that the show is its own canonical interpretation and that ambiguity is acceptable within the franchise's lore. The games themselves, as of 2026, have never definitively codified who launched first in the main text of the narrative. The question remains officially open. What is interesting about both answers, though, is what they say about the series' underlying themes. If China launched first because America lied about a biological weapons program, the story is about betrayal and the catastrophic consequences of broken trust between nations. If Vault Tech launched first because peace was inconvenient for their investments, the story is about corporate power, about the logical endpoint of capitalism unrestrained by ethics, about what happens when the people making weapons and bunkers have more to gain from catastrophe than from stability. Neither answer is random. Both are rooted in the same soil. The idea that the end of the world was not an accident or an inevitability. It was a choice. Someone made a decision, or a series of decisions, and those decisions accumulated into an event that killed billions of people in the span of a morning. The Great War, for all its apocalyptic scale, is a story about human agency, about the specific, particular ways in which human beings choose catastrophe when they could choose otherwise. There is a line of thinking in the Fallout fandom, one that has circulated for a long time, that suggests the most honest answer is the most uncomfortable one. It doesn't matter. Not in the way Kane originally meant, where the outcome supersedes the question. It doesn't matter in a deeper way. Because whoever launched the first missile, whether it was Beijing or a boardroom in some gleaming pre-war skyscraper, the conditions that made the launch possible were the work of decades. The resource wars, the Sino-American War, the FEV program, the vaults, the propaganda, the poisoned politics, the erosion of international trust. The first missile was just the moment when everything that had been building for generations became impossible to ignore. The wasteland doesn't care who pulled the trigger. The wasteland is what it is. And what it is what you get when you let things go wrong long enough without fixing them. There was also the cancelled Fallout film treatment, a script that was developed in the early days of the franchise before being set aside. That treatment had its own answer to the question. In the film's version of events, the first nuclear bomb was launched not by China or by the United States government or by Vault-Tec, but by a single individual, a zealot businessman, described in the treatment as a founder of the Vault system, who launched the first warhead to fulfill what he saw as a prophecy. His act triggered a panicked chain reaction among other countries. A 4-hour global war followed. Civilization ended. This version is the most frightening of all, because it reduces the end of the world to one man with a button and a conviction. No vast conspiracy, no corporate calculation, no geopolitical logic. Just a person who believed hard enough in something terrible to press the button that started everything. History is full of those people. The Fallout universe, if the film treatment's answer is taken as the truest interpretation, is built on the idea that all it takes is one. Whatever the true answer is, and the beauty of the franchise is that it may never be definitively settled, the Great War casts its shadow across every part of the universe. Every rusted vending machine, every crumbling overpass, every skeleton in a suit of power armor is downstream of that 2-hour morning in 2077 when someone decided that today was the day. Everything after is just the long, slow, terrible consequence. Section 3: Vault-Tec's Dark Architecture. The experiments that broke humanity. Imagine you are a parent. You have a daughter who is 7 and a son who is 11, and you live in a city that has just announced publicly, for the first time, that a nuclear war is genuinely possible within the next few years. The government has built bunkers. They are called vaults. They are offering spaces to a limited number of residents. The application is competitive. You have filled out the forms, paid the fees, attended the information sessions in a community center with turquoise walls and a Pip-Boy illustration on the welcome pamphlet. The representative from Vault-Tec has a wide, practiced smile and language that makes everything sound safe and manageable. You are told your family has been approved for Vault 11. You feel relieved. You feel grateful. You feel, for the first time in months, like you might be able to protect your children from what is coming. What you are not told is what Vault 11 actually is. The Vault-Tec experiments are one of the most chilling constructs in Fallout's fiction. They are chilling not because they are fantastical, but because they are recognizable. They wear the costume of institutional legitimacy, of scientific process, of official documentation, and they use that costume to do things that have no defense. What makes them work as horror is the gap between what the vaults were presented as, sanctuaries, and what most of them actually were, laboratories. And the specimens in those laboratories were the families who showed up with their suitcases and their children, believing they were being saved. The Vault program was conceived with a dual purpose that Vault-Tec executives understood and most Vault residents did not. The vaults were real shelters in the sense that they were structurally sound and could survive a nuclear exchange. The concrete was genuine. The water purification systems worked. The food supply was real. But the vast majority of vaults, possibly all of them, were also test environments. Each one was designed around an experiment. The residents were the subjects. The experiments were never disclosed. Vault 11 is where we should begin, because it represents something close to the purest distillation of what the Vault Tech program was capable of doing to human beings. The residents of Vault 11 were told upon entering that they had a single, ongoing obligation. Once per year, they had to sacrifice one of their own. One person, chosen by vote, sent into a chamber from which no one returned. If they made the sacrifice, the vault would continue to function. Life support, food, water, everything would keep running. If they refused, the vault systems would shut down and kill everyone. The initial assumption, the rational response of a person hearing these terms, is that this is a cruel coercion. You sacrifice one to save the many, year after year, and the vault systems reward your compliance by continuing to support life. What the residents of Vault 11 discovered, gradually and at enormous cost, was that this entire structure was a construct. The threat was not real. The vault systems were not actually contingent on the sacrifice. The experiment was about something entirely different. It was about political behavior, about how human beings organize themselves around existential threat, about whether a population forced to produce annual victims would build functional institutions around that requirement, whether democracy could be corrupted into a mechanism for selecting sacrificial victims, whether the logic of sacrifice for collective survival could be made to seem normal if the conditions were established early enough and consistently enough maintained. And they did. The residents built political parties. They campaigned. They made alliances. They traded favors and made promises, and developed ideology around who should be chosen and why. Over decades, distinct factions formed with distinct philosophies about sacrifice. Some argued that the old should be chosen first. Some argued for randomness. Some argued that criminals or dissenters should be offered up. The vault's population developed entire ethical frameworks to justify an annual murder. The terminal logs recovered from Vault 11, which the player finds in Fallout New Vegas, trace this history in excruciating detail. What begins as horror and grief gradually normalizes. What starts as a political crisis becomes a political system. People adapt because people always adapt. And the distance between refusing to participate and learning to live with participation shrinks over time, and then shrinks again, until eventually participation is just called life. Near the end, a group of 5 residents chose to end it. They refused to sacrifice anyone. They declared that if the vault systems were going to shut down and kill them all, then so be it. They stood in the main chamber and waited. The system played a recording. It informed them that they had passed the test. The true experiment had been to see if, eventually, a group would form that refused the terms entirely. The vault's doors would now unlock. They were free to leave. 4 of the 5 immediately took their own lives. The guilt of having survived a system that killed someone they knew every year, possibly for decades, was more than they could carry through an open door. The 5th walked out alone. Vault 11 is the most emotionally complete of the Vault Tech experiments because it shows the full arc. It shows what the experiment required of people, what they became in order to survive it, and what they were left with when the requirement was finally removed. The answer to that last question was not relief. It was wreckage. Vault 77 is quieter and in some ways more lonely. The experiment here was about the effects of extreme isolation on a human being. The vault was designed for one resident, one man, placed inside alone, with the vault's other standard amenities fully operational, and one unusual addition, crates upon crates of hand puppets. The man who was sealed in was the only resident. He was given an enormous stockpile of food and water, and the knowledge that no one was coming. His only social companions were puppets. Over time, documented in the webcomic and other supplementary material the game references, he began giving the puppets names and personalities. He began speaking to them as though they had inner lives. He built social structures among them, hierarchies and relationships and conflicts. He ran the vault not as a person living alone but as a community of dozens, each puppet with its own voice and its own role. After 2 years, there was a coup among the puppets. A faction he had not intended to create turned against him. In the internal logic of his isolated mind, he had become a genuine refugee from a society he had built himself. He fled the vault. On the surface, he was not a broken man in the conventional sense. He was functional. He was capable of violence. The slavers of Paradise Falls, one of the most feared groups in the capital wasteland, were reportedly afraid of him. What isolation does, according to Vault 77, is not destroy competence. It displaces identity. The man who emerged was effective and dangerous, but he had spent 2 years being a community of one. And he emerged not quite knowing where that community ended, and he began. Vault 92 fills a different kind of dread. It was populated specifically with musicians. The world's most gifted performers, composers, and artists offered survival in exchange for their talent. They were told the vault would preserve human cultural achievement, that their music would be protected from the war. They were given instruments. They were given recording equipment. The aesthetic of the vault was built around music, a celebration of what they were there to do. The experiment, however, was nothing to do with music at all. The vault's systems were designed to pump white noise through the residents' headphones during sleep, modulated with subliminal signals designed to trigger aggression. The musicians were not there because of their talent. They were there because of their psychological profile. Gifted creative people often have high levels of sensitivity and emotional engagement with their work. The experiment was testing whether subliminal messaging could be used to weaponize a population, whether violence could be induced in people not naturally inclined toward it through acoustic manipulation of sleeping minds. The first tests used isolated sound booths. The effects seemed minor, manageable. The overseer escalated. The subliminal messaging moved into the main vault speaker system. Personal headphones were prohibited. The entire population was now sleeping to sounds that were slowly rewriting how their brains processed threat and frustration. Residents began going into trance-like states. Some became paranoid. Arguments that would have been resolved through conversation began escalating into physical confrontations. And then residents began killing each other in ways that felt dreamlike and unplanned, as though the violence was happening to them rather than being committed by them. The logs from Vault 92, found in Fallout 3, are among the most disturbing in the series, partly because the people writing them are clearly articulate, clearly aware that something is wrong, and completely unable to stop what is happening to them or understand why. Vault 75 represents a particular horror because of who it was built around. Located beneath a middle school in the Commonwealth, the vault offered subsidized admittance to families, prioritizing parents with children of school age. This created a population with a high proportion of minors. Once sealed, the vault's experiment began. The children were separated from their parents. They were told this was for educational purposes, for structured learning programs. The parents, initially reassured, found themselves with decreasing access to their children, then no access. The children were subjected to genetic testing, physical conditioning, and eventually a systematic selection process designed to identify and cultivate what Vault-Tec called superior genetic material. The children who showed the most promise in the experiment's terms were retained. Those who did not were disposed of. The Vault's staff were trained to refer to the children not by name but by subject number after a certain point. The facilities were clinical, in the way that clinical sometimes becomes a synonym for something colder than the word suggests. The parents were kept alive in separated quarters, told various things about the status of the program, and eventually killed as they became inconvenient or attempted to interfere. What Vault 75 was building toward, over generations, was a population of enhanced humans bred and selected for specific traits that Vault-Tec valued. The children were not residents. They were the product. Vault 112 is different in character. Where most Vault experiments were about what populations of people do to each other under specific conditions, Vault 112 was about one man. The man's name was Stanislaus Braun, and he was Vault-Tec's head of research. Braun designed many of the Vault experiments. He was the architect, or one of the architects, of what happened in those sealed concrete corridors. And for himself, he chose something specific. Vault 112 was equipped with a virtual reality system called Tranquility Lane. All residents were placed in pods and connected to a persistent simulation, a digital representation of a quiet American suburb, frozen in the aesthetic of the 1950s. Braun placed himself in the simulation as well. From within it, he had administrative control over the environment. He could alter the weather, he could alter the physics, he could alter the behavior of other residents who were also in the simulation and had no way of knowing they were not in reality. By the time the lone wanderer finds Vault 112 in Fallout 3, roughly 200 years have passed. Every other resident of the simulation has died in their pod, their physical bodies degrading over 2 centuries, while their minds were trapped in Braun's digital suburb. Braun himself, whose genetic modifications as head of Vault Tech research may have extended his biological viability, remains. In the simulation, he presents as a little girl in a red dress, the administrative guise he chose for himself. He has been running Tranquility Lane for approximately 200 years. In that time, with an increasingly small pool of subjects whose behavior he can manipulate, he has effectively been running his own personal theater. Subjects are made to do things. The simulation is changed around them. Braun watches. Braun adjusts. Braun has had 2 centuries to perfect his boredom. It is one of the most quietly appalling images in Fallout. Not a monster in the dramatic sense. Not something with teeth and violence. A bureaucrat sitting at the center of a machine he built, doing what bureaucrats do, which is continue. He continues because he built this system for himself, and he is very good at continuing. The experiment is long over. Everyone who was supposed to be a subject is dead. What remains is just a man with access to a digital environment, filling the hours of centuries with whatever he can think to do next. There are 122 vaults in the Fallout universe. Not all of their experiments have been documented. Some, in the games and supplementary material, are listed as merely incomplete, their data lost or their populations expired before results could be collected. Some were functional as intended, actually preserving people through the war and releasing them to rebuild. Vault 81 in Fallout 4 was designed to test experimental cures for diseases, injecting subjects with various pathogens and testing potential treatments. The Overseer refused to follow the experiment's parameters. The subjects were never infected. The vault survived. Humans being human, refusing to follow instructions that they recognized as monstrous, exists in the Fallout world as surely as the instructions themselves. But the vaults that worked as intended, or that went wrong in directions Vault Tech could not control, are the ones the Wasteland remembers. They are cautionary tales that no one living actually learned their lesson from, because the people who needed to learn the lesson were all dead by the time the lesson became clear. Vault Tech is one of the most useful pieces of social commentary in the series. It asks what happens when the people building the shelters have more to gain from the storm than from the calm. It asks what a corporation does when its incentives align with catastrophe. It asks, and this is the question that makes the hairs on your arms stand up if you let it settle, were the vaults ever really about saving people, or were the people always incidental? The brochures were beautiful. The Pip-Boy mascot smiled. The facilities were clean and well lit and stocked with food. And underneath all of it, in almost every case, was something that had nothing to do with saving anybody. Section 4, The Dunwich Horror, Fallout's Lovecraftian Nightmare. There is a building in the Capital Wasteland that most experienced Fallout 3 players know about, but few discuss at length. It sits in the southwestern edge of the map, accessible but not required, mentioned nowhere in the game's main questline. If you follow the roads from Rivet City and keep walking west into increasingly barren country, past jagged rock formations and fields of rubble, you will eventually find it, the Dunwich Building. It does not look different from the outside. It is a ruined office block, the kind that fills the Capital Wasteland by the dozen, its glass long shattered, its upper floors collapsed inward, its parking lot scattered with the bones of old cars. Feral ghouls inhabit it, as they inhabit most abandoned structures. There is no reason, from the outside, to suspect that this building is different from any of the other collapsed office blocks in the wasteland. But it is different, in ways that the game reveals slowly, almost reluctantly, as though the building itself is uncertain about sharing what it contains. The strangeness begins with the name. H.P. Lovecraft wrote a story in 1928 called The Dunwich Horror. It is one of his most famous works, a tale set in rural Massachusetts, about a family with deep and terrible connections to something that exists outside the natural order of things. The name Dunwich, when you see it on a ruined office building in the middle of a nuclear wasteland, is not an accident. It is an invitation. Inside the building, a visitor named Jaime has left audio logs. You find them as you move through the levels, each one recording Jaime's descent from curious explorer to something much less coherent. The early logs are the voice of a person who has come to find something he believes is here. His father told him about this place before dying. His father had apparently found something inside the building, a book, and had been affected by it, changed by it in ways Jaime describes without quite being able to name. By the final log, Jamie's voice has abandoned most of the conventions of human speech. He talks about temples. He talks about feasts. He repeatedly says a name, Alhazred, and a word or name that may not be a word at all, Gyeth. Abdul Alhazred is, in the cosmology of H.P. Lovecraft, the author of the Necronomicon. He is the most famous fictional scholar of forbidden knowledge in Western literature. That his name is being spoken by a ghoulified man in the basement of an office building in a nuclear wasteland is, to put it mildly, information. The deeper you go into the Dunwich building, the more the architecture changes. The modern office interiors give way to older stonework, then to caves, as though the building was constructed on top of something much older. At the deepest level, in a space the game calls the virulent underchambers, there is an obelisk. The description of it, rendered in the game's early generation engine, is enough to communicate what it is meant to convey. It is roughly 4 to 5 feet tall, composed of dark stone, and carved with shapes that resist easy interpretation. Vines or tendril-like forms wrap around its base. Along its back surface, a row of skulls runs upward. At its face, a humanoid form appears to be emerging from or merging into the stone itself, the figure pressed against the interior of the obelisk as though trying to push through from the other side. When you approach it and attempt to interact with it, the game's text describes the physical sensation of proximity. It makes you uneasy just to stand near it. Feral ghouls surround the obelisk. They are not attacking it. They appear to be worshipping it. The distinction matters. These are creatures whose minds have been consumed by radiation, who operate on something barely above pure instinct, and whatever instinct remains in them, when they are near this object, makes them kneel. A voice whispers from the direction of the obelisk. It repeats words, Alhazred, Gyeth. It cycles through them, softly, without apparent cause or intention. The full context of what the Dunwich building is comes together only when Fallout 3's Point Lookout downloadable expansion is completed. In that expansion, the player encounters a book called the Kriv Bekni and a man named Obadiah Blackhall who is desperate to retrieve it. The Kriv Bekni is a leather-bound tome covered in old blood, used for occult purposes. The quest that follows, called The Dark Heart of Blackhall, ends with the player carrying the book to the Dunwich building and pressing it against the obelisk, which causes the book to ignite and destroys both objects. But the lore hidden in cut content and developer notes reveals more. The Dunwich family is real within Fallout's continuity. Richard Dunwich, the founder of Dunwich Borers LLC, was the patriarch of a family with generations-deep connections to something they called Ugg Qualtoth. This entity, never fully described anywhere in the games, appears to be the thing that the obelisk is connected to, or is a vessel for, or is in some sense a manifestation of. The Blackhall family, connected to the Dunwich by blood through ancestral lines, shares this connection. Both families were worshippers. Both families were using what they called occult practice to maintain a relationship with something that the games never illuminate directly. In Fallout 4, the Dunwich name reappears at a marble quarry called Dunwich Borers, a location that sits on the coast of the Commonwealth. This quarry contains its own peculiar properties. As you descend through its levels, the game begins giving the player hallucinations, brief visions of pre-war time, populated by ghostly figures going about ordinary tasks. These visions grow more intense and more disturbing as you go deeper. At the lowest level, there is a pool of dark water, and at the bottom of that pool, barely visible in the murk, is another obelisk, identical to the one beneath the Dunwich building, sitting at the bottom of the water as though it has always been there, as though the quarry was dug specifically to reach it. The connecting thread between these locations is the Dunwich family itself, and behind the family is the entity they worship. Ugg Qualtoth is never named in dialogue. It is never explained. It exists in the seams between things, in the space between where the lore gives you information and where it goes silent. And what the games are suggesting, through the architecture of Lovecraftian horror, rather than direct statement, is that the nuclear apocalypse may not have been the most significant catastrophe in this world's history. That there is something older, something that existed before the first vault was built or the first missile was designed, and that continues to exist now that those things have come and gone. The Dunwich narrative is the one place in Fallout where the horror is not man-made. Every other terrible thing in the wasteland has a human being behind it somewhere. Someone designed the FEV virus. Someone approved the vault experiments. Someone launched the missiles. The obelisk at the bottom of the Dunwich building has no human origin in the lore. It was there before the building was built around it. It will presumably still be there long after the building finishes collapsing. The ghouls that worship it seem to have given up the last fragments of human cognition in exchange for proximity to it. What it wants, if it wants anything, the games do not say. Jaime, in his last audio log, mostly rambles. He talks about feasts and temples. He says Al-Hazred. He says Gieth. And somewhere in the building below him, by the time any player finds his recording, he is already something else. He is one of the feral ghouls surrounding the obelisk. His name floats above him in the game's targeting system, a small cruelty, a reminder that this creature with no recognizable mind was once a person with a father and a curiosity about a building his father had told him about. If there is a mercy in the Dunwich narrative, it is a cold one. Jamie did find what he was looking for. He was looking for the thing his father had found. He found it. Whether that counts as what he wanted when he first walked through the door is a different question, and one the obelisk is not inclined to answer. Section 5, The Master and the Forced Evolutionary Virus, One Man's Descent into Godhood. In the original Fallout game, released in 1997, the final villain is not a warlord. He is not a general or a dictator or a corporate executive. He is a philosopher, a grotesque, magnificent, genuinely tragic philosopher who has transcended the human form to such a degree that he can no longer remember all of what he once was, and who has spent decades building an argument for the end of humanity in its current form, and the replacement of that humanity with something better. His name is the Master. His original name was Richard Moreau. The story of how Richard Moreau became the Master is one of the most extraordinary sequences of events in the entire Fallout universe. It begins in 2092, in a city called Vault City, a post-war settlement built by the survivors of Vault 8. Vault City was relatively prosperous, well-defended, technologically advanced. Richard Moreau was a doctor there, a man of evident intelligence and philosophical depth, who was accused of murder and exiled. The circumstances of that accusation are not confirmed. Whether he actually committed the murder, whether he was wrongly accused, whether the truth falls somewhere between those poles, the lore does not say. What it says is that he changed his name to Richard Gray and left. He walked away from Vault City into the wasteland with whatever he could carry, and he made his way to the Hub, a trading community in what had been California. There, he built a life as a doctor, a scholar, a person of local reputation. He was known as brilliant. He was known as thoughtful. He was, by most accounts, someone who had found a way to make something of himself in a hard world. On May 22nd, 2102, Gray was hired by a caravan boss named Harold to help investigate a group of raiders attacking Harold's supply routes. On June 23rd of that year, Gray's expedition located Mariposa Military Base, a pre-war military facility in California that had been conducting classified research before the Great War ended everything. What Mariposa Military Base had been researching was the forced evolutionary virus. The FEV, as it is usually called, began life as a project called the Pan-Immunity Virion Project, developed by West Tech Corporation for the United States military. The initial goal was extraordinary and, in a narrow scientific sense, successful. The virus was designed to rewrite the host's DNA, correcting genetic defects, eliminating disease vulnerabilities, and enhancing physical capability. In theory, it would produce something like an immune system that could handle any biological threat, a human body that couldn't be made sick. In practice, the results were substantially more dramatic. The FEV did not just correct existing DNA, it amplified it. It used the host's existing genetic template as a foundation and rebuilt from there, making everything more muscle mass, more bone density, a vastly altered neurochemistry. The early test subjects, exposed to raw FEV in the experimental vats at Mariposa, became enormous, green-skinned, hairless, and vastly physically powerful. They also, in most cases, lost significant cognitive function. Intelligence declined sharply in subjects who had been exposed without controlled preparation. The physical evolution came at the cost of the mental. These subjects became what the Fallout universe calls super mutants. Richard Gray's expedition found Mariposa Military Base still running its automated systems 2 decades after the Great War, the vats still full of FEV solution, the robots still carrying out their pre-war programming. The expedition was attacked. Most of Gray's team was killed. In the chaos, Gray himself was knocked by a mechanical arm into one of the vats. He survived. The FEV began its work on him immediately. What happened to Gray over the following weeks and months is documented in an audio diary he left in the base. It is one of the most disturbing sequences of text in the entire franchise, because it is written in the first person and because Gray is articulate enough to describe what is happening to him with clinical precision, even as what is happening to him removes him from the human category entirely. He describes the physical sensations first, his skin peeling, pain, then an unexpected strengthening, the sense of his body rebuilding itself faster and more completely than he had ever experienced. He describes regaining the ability to walk with more ease than before his exposure. And then something stranger. A tendril grew from his abdomen. He used it to absorb other organisms, merging them with his own tissue. A rat, a dog. He notes that these organisms seem to gain awareness upon merging with him, and he finds the experience philosophically interesting. His mind, far from degrading the way most FEV subjects' minds did, expanded. This appears to be an anomaly of his particular exposure, or possibly of his specific genetic baseline. Where the vat workers he encountered became muscle-bound and cognitively simplified, Gray became vast. His intelligence accelerated. His sensory apparatus grew. His capacity to process information, to hold multiple complex ideas simultaneously, to model systems and predict outcomes, went beyond anything a human nervous system normally produces. He also absorbed other organisms into himself, physically merging with them. Until after years of this process, he was no longer something that could be recognized as a single human body. He was a mass, a pulsing, vast, biomechanical aggregate of tissue and machinery and the remnants of the things he had absorbed. He eventually made his way to the cathedral, a location in what had been Los Angeles, and embedded himself in the basement, connecting to the building's systems and extending his awareness through them. He began calling himself the Master. From this position, the Master developed a philosophy, and the philosophy is genuinely worth examining, because it is not stupid. It is the reasoning of a brilliant mind that has been altered past the point of valuing what it once was. The Master looked at the history of the world he had emerged into, and he reached the following conclusions. Humanity, in its baseline form, was responsible for the Great War. Humanity was fragile, tribal, emotionally unstable, prone to the exact combination of intelligence and irrationality that produces catastrophe. The same species that had built cities and composed music and written philosophy had also built nuclear weapons and used them. Whatever was admirable about human beings was inseparable from whatever had destroyed civilization. His solution was evolution, not the random, undirected process of natural selection, which takes millennia and produces no guarantees. Forced evolution. The FEV would be used on every remaining human being. They would become super mutants, a unified race, free of the genetic variability and the tribal loyalties and the diseases and the petty individual grievances that had driven the old world to its destruction. One people, one form, impossible to divide against each other because they would all be the same. He called this project the Unity. The Vault Dweller, the player character in the first Fallout game, can eventually confront the Master and, if they have high enough intelligence and charisma, enter into a philosophical debate with him. And this is where the tragedy of the Master achieves its full depth, because it is possible, in dialogue, to prove to him that his plan will not work. Super mutants, it turns out, are sterile. The FEV that transforms humans eliminates their reproductive capability. The Unity, by its own internal logic, is not the beginning of a new civilization. It is a slow-motion extinction event for the human species. There will be one generation of super mutants and then nothing. When the Vault Dweller presents this argument, the Master considers it. His response, if you have followed the correct dialogue path, is devastating in its simplicity. He says that he hadn't considered that. He processes the information with the vast intelligence he has built over decades, and he accepts it. He acknowledges that the player is correct, and then he destroys himself and orders his forces to scatter. An enormous army, years of planning, an empire built on suffering and biology, dissolved not by superior firepower but by an argument about genetics. The Master, for all that he had become, was still functioning on the foundational logic of his philosophy. If the facts do not support the conclusion, revise the conclusion. Even when the conclusion is the whole reason you have been living. even when accepting the facts means accepting that everything you did was for nothing. It is the most human thing he does in the entire game, and it is done by a thing that has not been recognizably human for decades. The forced evolutionary virus continued to appear throughout the series in different forms and under different stewardships. Vault 87, in the Capital Wasteland explored in Fallout 3, conducted its own FEV experiments, creating the East Coast super mutants who stalk the ruins of Washington, D.C. These mutants, created from an incomplete strain of the virus, are generally less intelligent than their West Coast counterparts. They are bigger, cruder, more aggressive, and they continue to grow throughout their lives, eventually becoming the enormous creatures called behemoths if they live long enough. The Institute, in Fallout 4, conducted its own FEV research in a sealed laboratory, working toward applications the lore never fully explains. Before the experiments were shut down, following an incident that the Institute's own leadership refuses to clearly describe. And always, behind every application of the FEV, there is the shadow of what it was originally designed to do. West Tech made it as a super soldier program, a tool of war. The Great War killed the people who were directing that program, and the virus was left sitting in vats in a military base in California, waiting for whatever came next. What came next was Richard Gray falling into the vats. What came next was the Master. The FEV is the Fallout universe's clearest articulation of the danger of building something enormously powerful without a plan for what happens if you lose control of it. Every catastrophe the virus caused downstream of Mariposa military base traces back to a weapon that was built to solve a military problem and ended up outliving the war it was designed to fight. The soldiers who were supposed to use it died. The country that commissioned it burned. The company that made it was gone before the first super mutant opened its eyes. What remained was the thing they built. And the thing they built kept going. Section 6, The Mysterious Stranger. Who is he, really? Every few hours spent wandering the wasteland, if you have chosen a particular perk, a figure appears. He materializes during the slowed time combat system called VATS, stepping out of nowhere into the middle of a firefight. He is wearing a trench coat and a fedora, which in the context of a nuclear wasteland is an outfit choice of such breathtaking confidence that it demands explanation. He raises a large caliber revolver, fires once or twice, and then he is gone. A guitar sting sounds as he vanishes, something plucked from a 1950s crime drama or a spaghetti western, a sound that says, "Yes, I know exactly what I am." He is called the Mysterious Stranger. He has appeared in every Fallout game. No one knows who he is. This is not casual ignorance on the part of the people who populate the wasteland. It is specific, noted ignorance. Nick Valentine, the synth detective in Fallout 4 who has lived in the Commonwealth for decades and accumulated files on nearly every notable figure who has passed through his city, has a file on the Mysterious Stranger. In the notes he makes when the stranger appears during the player character's combat, Valentine acknowledges that the man has been active in multiple regions over a span of time that suggests he has been operating for decades. He acknowledges that the stranger appears to be invulnerable. No one can kill him. He leaves no traces that can be followed. He cannot be engaged in conversation under normal circumstances. Valentine's notes are the voice of a detective confronting the limits of detection. He has all of the observable facts. He cannot build from those facts to an explanation that satisfies him. The Mysterious Stranger is, to Valentine, a genuinely open case. What the games provide instead of an explanation is a collection of implications scattered across multiple entries that suggest a partial picture without completing it. Start with Fallout New Vegas and the character called the Lonesome Drifter. You find the drifter on the side of the road in the Mojave playing a guitar. He has the easy melancholy of someone who has been walking for a long time. In conversation, if you have the right dialogue options, you can ask about his past, and he will tell you that he grew up without a father, that his father was a mysterious figure, a stranger to his own family, that he never knew him, that his father left when he was young, or perhaps never really arrived, and he has been looking for him ever since. He has his father's gun, a .44 Magnum. When he draws it, the same guitar sting plays that you hear every time the mysterious stranger vanishes into the air. The implication is precise and deliberate. The Lonesome Drifter is the mysterious stranger's son, and the stranger, who appears from nowhere to help strangers in combat, apparently has never made the same appearance in the life of his own child. This detail, combined with everything else the games offer, builds a portrait that is more melancholy than it is supernatural. Whatever the mysterious stranger is, whatever keeps him operating across decades and multiple regions, whatever makes him unkillable and untrackable, he carries with him the weight of a person who left someone behind. The son with the same gun and the same music is looking for a father who materializes to help strangers, and then disappears before anyone can ask him why he never came home. The appearance of the mysterious stranger changes between games in ways that create additional complications. In Fallout 3 and New Vegas, he appears as a young Asian man. In Fallout 4, he appears as a middle-aged white man with a mustache. These are different people in different games, or they are the same person altered by time and circumstance, or the visual differences are simply the product of different development teams making different artistic decisions. The lore does not clarify. What it does offer is Nick Valentine's observation in Fallout 4 that the stranger has been active in the Commonwealth and the Capital Wasteland, which represents a geographic range that spans the entire east coast of the former United States. Getting from Washington, D.C. to Boston and back again, in a world without functioning infrastructure, is not a casual journey. The stranger moves through the wasteland in a way that suggests he is not constrained by the logistics that constrain everyone else. The supernatural element of his existence, his invulnerability, and his ability to vanish without a trace, has generated theories that range from the mundane to the cosmic. Some theories position him as a very skilled human being with exceptional training, possibly a pre-war operative whose conditioning and equipment give him advantages that read as supernatural to less prepared observers. Some theories position him as a ghoul, a human whose exposure to radiation slowed or halted aging, which would explain how he can operate across generations without apparent aging. Some theories suggest he is a synth, a creation of the Institute, operating under programming that compels him to assist specific categories of individuals. Some theories suggest he is something older and stranger than any of those explanations, something connected to the same category of phenomena as the Dunwich obelisk, a being that exists adjacent to the normal world and intersects with it according to rules that are not human rules. None of these theories are confirmed. The mysterious stranger remains, as his name insists, mysterious. What the games seem most interested in, ultimately, is what his existence says about the wasteland and the people who survive in it. In a world this broken, this full of death and betrayal and failed institutions, a figure materializes from time to time to tip a difficult fight in a survivor's favor. He asks for nothing. He explains nothing. He simply appears at the moment of need and then is gone. The guitar sting he leaves behind sounds like a memory of a world that had a genre, a world where the good guys wore certain clothes and carried certain guns and showed up at the right moment. The wasteland does not have those stories. Or if it does, they do not work out the way the genre promises. The mysterious stranger is, in this reading, a projection of what the wasteland survivors want to believe about the world they are living in. That somewhere, some force, however inexplicable, is at least occasionally on their side. His son is still walking the Mojave, playing his guitar, looking for a father who never quite seems to be where he is. The gun plays the same song every time it clears the holster. And the mysterious stranger keeps appearing in other people's moments of need, leaving his own family's need unsatisfied. Whether that is heroism or abandonment, the games leave firmly in the eye of whoever is watching. Section 7: Ulysses and the Divide. The Courier's Forgotten Sin. There is something unusual about the beginning of Fallout New Vegas, and most players notice it only as an aesthetic detail, a bit of character setup, before moving on to the business of surviving the Mojave. The Courier, the player character, is shot twice in the head and left in a shallow grave. A man named Benny did this. The Courier is dug out by a robot and brought to a doctor named Mitchell in the town of Goodsprings. They are saved, the game begins. What most players do not immediately ask is, why was the Courier the one carrying the package? The job, delivering an encoded platinum chip across the Mojave, had been assigned to a different courier first. That courier, the one who was supposed to carry the chip, declined the job at the last moment. No explanation was given. He simply walked away, leaving the job to whoever was next on the list. His name was Ulysses. He chose his name in honor of Ulysses S. Grant, the American general and president, because Ulysses grew up in a world where the symbols of a dead nation were scattered across the wasteland, and he was a man who thought deeply about what symbols meant and what they cost. He wore a duster with the American flag on its back. He had dreadlocks that, in the culture of his original tribe, the Twisted Hairs of Arizona, were a living record of a person's life and deeds. Ulysses first encountered the courier before the events of the game, not in person, as a presence, as a circumstance. The story requires some geography. Before the Mojave became the setting of New Vegas, there was a place in the western wastes called the Divide. It was, for a brief period, something extraordinary. A small community was growing there, built at the intersection of trade routes, connected enough to the wider world to be viable and isolated enough to be its own thing. Ulysses found it while scouting for Caesar's Legion, the post-apocalyptic empire that takes the Mojave as one of its primary theaters of expansion. He described the Divide, in notes found throughout the game, as a nation taking its first breath, a community that had stumbled into the ingredients of something sustainable. He thought about leaving the Legion to stay there. The courier also knew the Divide, had worked there. The NCR, the New California Republic, the Democratic Federation that contests with Caesar's Legion for control of the Mojave, discovered the Divide and annexed it, and the courier, working as a courier for the NCR at the time, had been tasked with delivering packages there. One of those packages, retrieved by the NCR from the ruins of Navarro, a former enclave base near San Francisco, contained a device connected to old United States military infrastructure. The package was delivered. The courier left. The device in the package was a detonator. It was connected, through protocols buried in the Divide's underground infrastructure, to nuclear warheads that had been sitting dormant in silos beneath the community for years, left over from the old military installation the Divide had been built on top of. No one who handled the package knew what was in it. The courier certainly didn't. It was just a job, just a delivery. The detonator activated. The warheads detonated. The earthquakes that followed were catastrophic, the terrain heaving and splitting, the surface of the Divide becoming the riven, hurricane-swept canyon of perpetual storms. It is by the time the player sees it in the Lonesome Road expansion. Most of the community was killed instantly. Others were transformed by the radiation into the marked men, creatures caught between death and something else, their skin burned away by the blasts, their minds stripped of everything but pain and aggression. The community that Ulysses had imagined as the first breath of a new nation was gone in an afternoon. Ulysses survived. He is never fully clear about how. Medical eyebots found in the Divide helped. The flag on his back, with its symbolism of endurance and continuity, kept him moving in a metaphorical sense that he takes seriously and literally. He was the only unaltered survivor. He walked out of the Divide carrying everything he had come to believe about what a person could do to a nation, which was now a lot. More than they might intend, more than they might ever know. He blamed the courier. This is where the lore becomes genuinely ambiguous, and where Lonesome Road is most interesting. The courier did not set out to destroy the Divide. They did not know what was in the package. From their perspective, they completed a job and moved on. The destruction of the Divide was an accident, a consequence of carrying something that no one who handled it understood. But Ulysses' counter-argument, developed across the holotapes and the monologues that comprise most of his characterization in the DLC, is about the nature of consequences as opposed to intentions. The Divide is gone. The people who were building something there are dead. The fact that the courier did not know is not the same as the fact that the courier did not do it. He is not wrong, and the courier has no real defense. They cannot say they did not carry the package. They cannot say the Divide still stands. All they can offer is, "I didn't mean to." And Ulysses, with 2 centuries of wasteland philosophy in his bones and a homeland turned to rubble by an accidental delivery, finds that offer insufficient. The choice Ulysses made when he saw the courier's name on the list for the platinum chip job was precise. He stepped aside, knowing the courier would take the job, knowing Benny would be waiting, knowing what was at the start of that road and wanting the courier to walk it, not because he expected them to die, but because he wanted them to come to the Divide afterward. He wanted a confrontation. He wanted to stand in front of the person who had, however accidentally, destroyed his home, and make them reckon with it. By the time that confrontation happens, if the player has listened to all of Ulysses' holotapes across the DLC's preceding content, the experience is one of the most emotionally complex conversations in Fallout's history. Because Ulysses is not simply angry. He is exhausted and philosophical and genuinely uncertain about what he wants from the meeting. He wants the courier to understand. He wants to understand them. He has built the courier into a symbol, the way he builds everything into symbols, and he needs to know if the symbol holds up under scrutiny. You can talk him down. If you have listened carefully enough to know what he values, what his actual beliefs are underneath the anger, you can make the argument that matches his philosophy. The argument that says, destroying what you destroyed is not building what you wanted. Wiping out the NCR or Caesar's Legion or both with the nuclear weapons he has been preparing to launch is not building a nation. It is repeating the only thing that has ever happened to the places he has called home. He considers this. He is, by the end, a man who has processed so much grief and ideology that processing more is simply what he does. He concludes that you are right. He stands down. He stays in the divide. The holotape he leaves for the player, which can be found after the confrontation, is the voice of a person who has decided that staying means something. The marked men, the night stalkers, the ruins of what was once his home. He is going to stay with them. He is going to try to do something for them, whatever can be done for creatures that far past helping. Because the alternative is to keep walking, keep carrying the weight, keep looking for a place where the weight is appropriate, and he has decided that the divide is where the weight belongs. It is one of the most beautiful and specific character resolutions in the series. A man who built his entire worldview around the power of symbols, who named himself after a general who rebuilt a broken country, who wore an old nation's flag when that nation was ash, deciding at the end that staying in the place where things went wrong is itself a kind of symbol. That being present in the ruins is a choice that means something, even if no one else is there to observe it. The courier walks back up the road alone. Ulysses stays. The divide keeps its storms. Section 8. The Institute. The boogeyman beneath Boston. There is a particular kind of terror that has nothing to do with the supernatural. It is the terror of not knowing, of looking at your neighbor and wondering, of picking up a cup of coffee that someone handed you and not being entirely certain, for just a moment, who handed it. This is the terror that the Institute generates in Fallout 4's Commonwealth. Not the specific, identifiable fear of a raider at your door or a deathclaw in the next room. The formless, ambient fear of replacement, of substitution, of the possibility that the person you think you are talking to is not a person at all. The Institute is, in the present day of Fallout 4, a self-contained scientific society buried somewhere beneath the ruins of Boston, accessible only by a teleportation system they built themselves and that no one else in the Commonwealth can replicate. They have been down there for over 200 years. They have not stopped working in all that time. Their origin is the Commonwealth Institute of Technology. Before the Great War, CIT, as it was called, was one of the most prestigious research universities on the East Coast. Its campus occupied prime real estate in what was then an affluent part of the city. Its faculty were renowned in fields ranging from engineering to biology to computer science. Its alumni network extended into the government, into the military, into corporate research. When the bombs fell on October 23, 2077, a portion of the university's scientific staff had prepared. They had access to an experimental nuclear reactor in the campus's underground research facilities, which had been built to provide power for classified research projects. The underground areas were hardened, structurally reinforced in ways the upper campus was not. Some number of scientists and their families took refuge below ground as the city above them burned. They survived the immediate catastrophe, and then, in the years and decades that followed, they discovered that they were very good at not going back up. The Institute, as a formal organization, was established in 2110, more than 30 years after the Great War ended. By then, the original survivors were elderly or dead, and their children, born underground and raised in an environment of controlled scientific endeavor, had made the decision to formalize what they had been building. They had technology. They had knowledge. They had a functional reactor. What they lacked, initially, was a clear purpose beyond survival. That purpose developed over time, and its development is where the Institute's trajectory becomes disturbing. The early Institute had genuine ambitions for the surface. They engaged with the communities that were forming in the ruins of the Commonwealth. They shared some of their technology. They tried to participate in the larger project of rebuilding. In 2227, there was a meeting of Commonwealth leaders, representatives from the various groups and settlements that had established themselves in the region, aimed at creating some kind of unified authority for the area. The Institute sent a representative. The representative was a synth. And something went wrong. Whatever happened at that meeting, the event the lore calls the Broken Mask Incident, a synthetic human went haywire in a room full of Commonwealth leaders and killed several of them. The Institute's hope of peaceful integration into a rebuilding society effectively ended in that room. The Commonwealth's leaders left the meeting terrified of what the Institute could do, terrified specifically of the possibility of a machine that looked exactly like a human being being placed anywhere, among anyone, for any purpose. The massacre of the Commonwealth Provisional Government, which followed and was connected to Institute activity, cemented this terror into something generational. By the time the sole survivor arrives in the Commonwealth in 2087, the Institute has been a boogeyman for a century. Children are told about it. Adults speak of it in hushed voices. Stories circulate about people who were taken, people who were replaced. Whether your husband is your husband, whether your friend is your friend, the Institute has, through its actions over 2 centuries, made paranoia into a survival skill in the Commonwealth. The synths themselves are the centerpiece of the Institute's technological achievement, and they represent one of the series' most philosophically rich questions. The first-generation synths, called Gen 1s, are clearly robotic. Metal chassis, obvious mechanical operation, no one is going to mistake them for human. The Gen 2s are more sophisticated, with more human-like proportions and more fluid movement, but they still read as machines. The Gen 3s are different. Gen 3 synths are biologically indistinguishable from humans. They have skin, they have musculature, they bleed, their organs function. They were created from a template of human biology augmented by Institute engineering, and the result is something that a standard medical examination could not distinguish from a person born of 2 parents. They experience emotions, they form preferences, they develop relationships. They can be made to believe they have a history, a childhood, a life of experiences that are entirely fabricated but feel, from inside, as real as any other memory. The question the game asks about Gen 3 synths, and leaves genuinely unresolved, is whether they are people. The Railroad faction says yes, unambiguously. The Institute says no, with the same unambiguous confidence. The Brotherhood of Steel says the question is moot, as they are machines and machines are tools. The Minutemen do not really have a position. The player must navigate between these perspectives and eventually decide, through the game's faction structure, who is right. But the game does not make it easy, and the most honest reading of Fallout 4's text is that the game does not know the answer either. It presents enough evidence for personhood in the behavior and inner lives of specific synths like Nick Valentine and the companion Curie to make the Institute's position feel monstrous. It presents enough of the Institute's internal logic to make their position something other than simple evil. Father, the head of the Institute at the time of the game, is the child the sole survivor lost 200 years ago, Sean. He was taken as an infant by the Institute, raised among the scientists, and became their leader. He is an old man now. He built the Institute into what it is. He designed the synths. He built the teleportation technology. He has spent his entire life in the service of a vision of the future that the rest of the Commonwealth finds indistinguishable from a nightmare. And when he finally meets his parent, the frozen person thawed from a vault 2 centuries after everything ended, there is a scene of extraordinary sadness. Because Sean did not thaw his parent because he missed them. He thawed them as an experiment. He needed a baseline sample of pre-war human DNA. His parent was a source, not a person, until the moment he decided, late in his life, to make them something more. The Institute's story is the story of what happens when intelligence is separated from accountability for long enough. They are brilliant. They have access to technologies that the surface cannot imagine. They could, in theory, do enormous good. What they have actually done is hide underground for 2 centuries, conducting research on unwilling subjects kidnapped from the surface, replacing people with synthetic copies for undisclosed purposes, and treating the Commonwealth as a resource rather than a community. Their official position is that they are working toward a better future for humanity. The future they are building, based on their actions rather than their stated intentions, is one where humanity is a raw material. The sole survivor's choice about what to do with the Institute at the end of the game's main story is one of the franchise's most genuinely difficult decisions, because the game has, if it has done its job, given you enough information about what the Institute is to make you uncertain. Not uncertain about the harm they have caused, about whether the harm is the whole story, whether there is something underneath the harm that could have been different, if the history had gone differently, if the broken mask incident hadn't ended the possibility of surface integration before it really began. The Institute chose to go underground after the world broke. In going underground, they lost something. It took them 200 years to notice, and by then the loss had become policy. Section 9. The Aliens Among Us. Zetans and the Long Cosmic Watch. There is a crash site in the capital wasteland that most guides describe as an optional point of interest. It sits in the northern region of the map, marked by a downed spacecraft, the size of a large car, embedded in the Earth at an angle that suggests it fell from a considerable height. Next to the craft, a small alien body lies in the dirt. It has the proportions that the 20th century's popular imagination associated with extraterrestrial visitors. Enormous head, huge dark eyes, small body, gray-green skin. In its hands, an energy weapon unlike anything the old United States military developed, at least not officially. If you find this crash site and interact with the alien body, you receive the Alien Blaster, one of the most powerful weapons in the game. And if you have purchased the Mothership Zeta expansion, interacting with the crash site triggers a beam of light from above, and the next thing you know, you are aboard a spaceship. The aliens in Fallout are called Zetans, a name taken from Zeta Reticulans, the designation that real-world extraterrestrial theorists have long applied to the short gray alien archetype that dominates abduction narratives and cultural depictions of extraterrestrial life. The name appears in the franchise's in-universe fiction, in an issue of the post-war pulp magazine Astoundingly Awesome Tales. The fictional acknowledgement of their own existence in in-universe media is the kind of detail that suggests the Fallout universe takes them seriously as a real phenomenon within its cosmology. And it should, because the Zetans have been in this universe for a very long time. The Mothership Zeta expansion takes place entirely aboard a vast alien spacecraft, and the experience of moving through it reveals a history of activity that stretches back centuries. The ship contains cryopreserved humans taken from Earth at various points in history. The player encounters a samurai from feudal Japan, a cowboy from the American frontier, a frontier pilgrim, a World War II aircraft pilot, and then soldiers from the pre-war era. These are not the results of recent activity. The Zetans have been visiting Earth, abducting humans, studying them, for at minimum 400 or 500 years by the time the 23rd century rolls around. The pre-war United States government was aware of them. This is not speculation but canon, established in terminal entries and lore documents. The government knew aliens were visiting. They had recovered hardware from crashes, including the crash in New Mexico in the 1940s that the Fallout universe's version of Roswell represents. The Enclave, the shadow government that remained operational after the Great War, had access to alien technology and used aspects of it in the development of their more exotic weapons systems. Alien technology, or technology heavily derived from alien principles, appears in some of the most advanced pre-war hardware. The question of what the Zetans actually want is one that Mothership Zeta gestures at without quite answering. They conduct experiments, they collect specimens, they observe. They have been doing this for long enough that several generations of their own species have presumably come and gone during the period of their Earth watching. What they are trying to learn, or what they plan to do with what they have learned, the game does not say. The player's experience aboard the ship is too chaotic and too survival-focused to allow for the kind of philosophical dialogue that might illuminate Zetan motivations. What can be assembled from the evidence is a picture of an extraterrestrial civilization with an extremely long perspective. If you have been watching a planet for 4 centuries, your relationship to that planet's current events, whatever war is happening, whatever political structure is collapsing, whatever apocalypse is unfolding, is necessarily different from the perspective of the creatures who are living through it. To the Zetans, the Great War was an event on a timeline that also includes the Napoleonic era and the Black Death and the end of the last ice age. Their interest in humanity is either purely scientific, the dispassionate recording of data about a species of some interest, or something else, something the games do not illuminate, because that illumination would require the kind of sustained dialogue between human and alien that the survival structure of Mothership Zeta never quite enables. The Alien Blaster, that weapon you retrieve from the crash site in the first place, is in some ways the most interesting artifact of the Zetan presence. It fires a projectile of energy that has no equivalent in human weapons development, at a power level that most pre-war military hardware cannot match. The existence of this weapon, available to any player with luck and a willingness to explore, is the game's acknowledgement that the Zetans represent a technological category entirely above anything humanity built before the apocalypse. The best human weapons, The plasma rifles and the laser cannons and the Gauss guns are sophisticated and powerful. The alien blaster is in a different conversation entirely. In Fallout New Vegas, if you have chosen the Wild Wasteland trait, which adds more eccentric content to your playthrough, you can encounter a Zetan craft near the Mojave. In Fallout 4, a Zetan scout ship crashes east of Oberlin Station, and the pilot, injured in the crash, retreats to a cave nearby. These appearances have the quality of brief visitations, a reminder that the Zetans are always out there, always passing through, continuing their long watch regardless of what is happening on the surface. The Fallout 76 expansion Steel Rain, set in Appalachia, introduces additional Zetan activity in the region, where they appear to be in some kind of conflict with a surviving organization connected to the Enclave. This adds another layer to the picture. The Zetans are not simply observers. At certain points and under certain conditions they engage. They have something resembling an agenda, even if that agenda remains opaque. There is something appropriately cosmic about the aliens' presence in the Fallout universe. In a world where humanity has done its absolute worst, where civilization ended in 2 hours of fire, where the ruins of everything a species built over 10,000 years of effort are scattered across the landscape, the Zetans continue their patient observation from above. Whatever they are watching for, they are still watching. The Great War was not the kind of event that caused them to pack up and go home. If anything, it may have made the observation more interesting. The human beings in the wasteland, struggling over water and food and territory, building small communities that are regularly destroyed and slowly rebuilt, are being watched by something whose temporal perspective makes the entirety of human civilization a relatively brief episode in a longer story. That awareness, held lightly, is both unsettling and strangely comforting. The universe is paying attention. Whether that attention is benign or neutral or something the games have not yet made room to explore, remains one of the Fallout universe's genuinely open questions. Section 10 Mothman and the Interloper. Appalachia's Ancient Darkness. Fallout 76 is set in West Virginia, and the choice of setting was not arbitrary. West Virginia is a state with deep roots in American folklore, in the specific kind of rural mythology that grows up in places where mountains and forests create natural boundaries, where communities are isolated enough from the mainstream to develop their own stories, their own understanding of the world and what moves through it. It is a place where the boundary between the rational and the inexplicable has always been more porous than in flatter, more urban landscapes. The Mothman is real folklore. The original sightings occurred around Point Pleasant, West Virginia, between November 1966 and December 1967. The first reported encounter described a large winged creature, between 6 and 7 feet tall, with enormous glowing red eyes and a wingspan of 10 to 15 feet, which observers described as a man shape but also as something distinctly not human in its movement and its gaze. Dozens of reported sightings followed. The encounters were concentrated in an area called the TNT area, a former munitions site outside the town, and they culminated, in the mythology if not the verified history, with the collapse of the Silver Bridge across the Ohio River in December 1967, which killed 46 people. Whether the Mothman was a warning of that collapse, whether it appeared in connection with the disaster, whether it was a large bird misidentified in the dark, whether it was a shared hallucination produced by some contaminant at the old TNT site, whether it was something that does not fit easily into any of these categories, the real-world record does not settle. What it left behind was a town that has built an entire civic identity around the creature, with a Mothman museum and a Mothman statue and an annual festival. Point Pleasant knows what it is associated with, and it has decided to lean into that association with considerable enthusiasm. Fallout 76 takes this history and builds on it in ways that are consistent with the series' tendency toward layering real-world reference with its own speculative mythology. In the game's version of Point Pleasant, there is a Mothman museum, and there is evidence of a pre-war cult that had formed around the creature. The cult of the Mothman was operating secretly beneath the museum before the Great War. They believed the Mothman was a divine presence, a creature of cosmic significance whose appearances portended disaster and whose nature, if properly understood, could give its worshippers access to warnings that would allow them to survive what was coming. Some of them argued that Mothman had tried to warn them about the Great War and that they had failed to heed the warning correctly. The cult's pre-war notes, scattered through the game's world in holotapes and written documents, trace the escalating urgency of people who believed they were seeing omens and were struggling to interpret them correctly before time ran out. After the bombs fell, the cult essentially ceased to exist as a coherent organization. What remained were the shrines they had built, and the Mothmen themselves. Large mutated insects, giant moths with luminescent eyes and unusual behavioral patterns that inhabit Appalachia in significant numbers in the game's present day. Whether these creatures are what the original cult was worshipping, or whether what the cult was worshipping was something else entirely that the Mothmen represent or embody, the game leaves genuinely uncertain. What is certain is that there are multiple kinds of Mothmen in the game. The standard Mothmen, aggressive and territorial. The red-eyed Mothmen, more dangerous and more numerous in areas associated with cult activity. A variant called the Wise Mothman, which has green eyes and behaves differently, appearing briefly and then vanishing, not attacking unless provoked. And, in very rare circumstances, the glowing Mothman, which appears as a spontaneous event during specific in-game circumstances, a creature of enormous power and unusual presence. The cult itself did not entirely die. By 2103, 25 years after the Great War, a new generation of cultists had formed in Appalachia, worshipping the Mothmen as living gods. They are hostile to outsiders. They live in Point Pleasant and in the structure called Lucky Hole Mine, a location that takes the Mothman mythology somewhere considerably darker. Lucky Hole Mine is where you encounter the interloper. Deep in the mine, past the standard Mothman shrines, past the ritual spaces and the evidence of the cult's devotion, there is something else. The mine descends into a space that was clearly modified by human effort but that has been changed by whatever now occupies it. The writing on the walls is not the same as the Mothman cult's writing. Holotapes found in the mine, left by a man named Jeff Lane, describe a process that is something close to possession. Lane initially came to the mine as a Mothman worshipper. Over time, something in the mine communicated with him in a way that he describes as hearing without sound, understanding without words. The thing in the mine reached into his mind and showed him something. He became what he calls a vessel. The interloper is never fully shown. It is suggested by the art and the architecture and the behavior of the cultists who have fallen under its influence. It is something older than the Mothman. Something that may predate the cult, may predate the town, may predate the history of the region entirely. The connection between the interloper and the Dunwich entity Ugg-Qualtoth, which appears in Fallout 3 and 4, is never confirmed in the games. But the structural similarities, the ancient stone, the sense of a presence that communicates without conventional language, the pattern of people going into places and coming out as something other than what they were, suggest that the Fallout universe may be building toward a connective tissue between these phenomena. Jeff Lane's final holotapes, recorded deep in Lucky Hole Mine, are the voice of a person who has decided that what he found is worth becoming. He does not describe fear. He describes a kind of relief, the relief of a person who has been looking for something larger than himself and has found it, regardless of what that thing is. The question the lore invites you to ask, and refuses to answer, is whether what Lane found is actually what he thinks it is, a cosmic intelligence of some kind worth becoming a vessel for, or whether it is something that simply presents itself as worthy of that surrender and benefits from the surrender without warranting it. The Mothman cultists who remained in Appalachia, the red-eyed ones who stayed in Point Pleasant while the green-eyed splinter sect called the Enlightened moved away, are fully committed to whatever they found in that mine. They have built a world entirely organized around it. They sacrifice, they worship, they drive out anyone who doesn't share their devotion. In the wider context of the Fallout universe, Appalachia's darkness is a specific regional expression of something the series keeps returning to. The possibility that the nuclear apocalypse did not only reveal the worst of human nature, it also, perhaps, disturbed something that had been resting quietly beneath the surface of the world, in the seams between things, in the old dark places that the modern world had built over without examining. The bombs fell. The surface changed. And whatever had been waiting in Lucky Hole Mine, patient in the dark, found that patience rewarded. Section 11. The Smaller Mysteries. Scattered Secrets of the Wasteland. The great mysteries of the Fallout universe are the ones with names. The Great War, the Institute, the Mysterious Stranger. These are the questions that have generated decades of debate and thousands of words of fan theory. But the Wasteland is full of smaller mysteries too. things that do not resolve into grand narratives but that leave an impression nonetheless, like a single photograph found in the back of a drawer in an abandoned house, compelling for reasons you cannot quite name. Pikmin's Gallery, in Fallout 4, is the home of an artist, Pikmin, who will give the player a key to a hidden cache if they help him survive an encounter with raiders, is also clearly a murderer. The gallery is decorated with his paintings, which are extraordinary in their technical execution, and which depict acts of violence against human beings with a specificity and an attention to texture that goes beyond what any normal imagination could produce in adequate detail. Pikmin's models are not invented. The gallery's basement contains evidence of the actual process. The name Pikmin is another Lovecraftian reference. Richard Pikmin appears in a story called Pikmin's Model, published in 1926, about a Boston artist whose paintings are so disturbing that even his fellow painters cannot look at them without feeling ill. The story's narrator eventually discovers what Pikmin's models actually are, and the revelation destroys him. The game's Pikmin does not get the full Lovecraftian treatment. He is a human serial killer, albeit one with extraordinary artistic talent, and the connection to the story is more of a nod than a structural parallel. But Pikmin is interesting as a wasteland mystery because he represents a specific category of survivor, the person who was already doing terrible things before the apocalypse gave everyone permission, who found that the end of civilization simply removed the obstacles that had previously required his concealment. What the wasteland brought out in Pikmin was what was already in him, just given more room to move. The question his existence poses is about whether the wasteland creates monsters or reveals them, whether the people who behave monstrously in the ruins of civilization were always who they turned out to be, restrained by order, or whether order's collapse actively produced the monster. There is a man in Fallout 3 called the Mechanist. He appears during a side quest in a town called Canterbury Commons, where a conflict has been escalating between two people playing out power fantasies with robots they have found or built. One of them is dressed as a superhero. One of them is the Mechanist, a man who believes he is protecting the town from dangerous robots by deploying his own robots to fight the dangerous robots, which is not working the way he imagines it is working. The quest resolves, in most playthroughs, with the player shutting down the situation. The Mechanist reappears in Fallout 4, in the Automatron expansion. Here the character has evolved, a woman this time, named Isabel Cruz, who built a network of robots across the Commonwealth and programmed them to eliminate threats. The programming went wrong. The robots began identifying too many things as threats. What started as a protective system became a scourge. Isabel has been hiding in her facility, watching her robots kill people, unable to stop them, consumed by guilt about what she created. Both iterations of the Mechanist are doing the same thing, trying to protect people with technology and discovering that the technology does not respect the intent. The machines do what they do according to their programming, and the programming, however carefully designed, is never quite subtle enough to match the complexity of what the world actually presents it with. The Mechanist is the Fallout universe's recurring meditation on the gap between what we build and what it becomes when we let it go. Point Lookout. The swamp-based expansion for Fallout 3 is full of mysteries. The settlement of Grognax is staffed by inbred tribals descended from pre-war residents of the area, who have developed their own mythology and their own rights over 2 centuries of isolation. The book The Kriv Bekni appears here, connecting Point Lookout to the Dunwich mythology. But the specific mystery that sticks is the Turtledove Detention Camp, a facility where pre-war America had been incarcerating its own citizens, people deemed threats to the wartime state, people whose names appear in files that suggest some of them were detained for nothing more than expressing dissent. The war created the facility. The bombs destroyed it, and the bombs destroyed everyone in it, detainees and guards alike. What remains is paperwork. The mystery of Turtledove is not about who built it. It is about what kind of country builds it. The answer for the Fallout universe is the same kind of country that funds Vault-Tec experiments and builds FEV programs. A country that has decided security is more important than the rights of the people it is supposed to be securing. A country that has decided some people are too inconvenient to leave free. The ruins of Turtledove are not dramatic. They are quiet in the way that real cruelty is often quiet, bureaucratic and orderly and documented, and left behind when the emergency that justified it turned out to be nothing compared to what came after. The Silver Shroud is a beloved mystery in Fallout 4, but what makes it interesting beyond its surface entertainment value is what it says about how human beings in the wasteland construct meaning. The Silver Shroud was a pre-war radio drama, a superhero story about a vigilante who haunts the streets of Goodneighbor. The recordings exist in the wasteland. And the people in Goodneighbor, 2 centuries after those recordings were made, listen to them. They have built a relationship with this fictional character that is real in the sense that matters. It fills something that needs filling. The idea of a protector who appears from nowhere and punishes the guilty is a story the wasteland needs. When the player puts on the Silver Shroud's costume and begins acting as the character, the response from certain NPCs is touching in a way that the quest earns. Because they know, on some level, that this is a person in a costume. They also choose, in the way that people always choose when the choice is between believing in something they need and doubting it, to respond to the costume as though it means what it was always meant to mean. The Silver Shroud is real because they need the Silver Shroud to be real. That is not self-deception. That is how human beings have always processed the gap between the world as it is and the world as it needs to be. The ghoul named Kent Connolly, who starts the Silver Shroud quest, has been listening to those old radio recordings for longer than most humans in the Commonwealth have been alive. He has memorized the character's lines. He is the Shroud's most devoted scholar, and when the player becomes the Shroud, he is also the character's most generous audience. The quest, played fully and sympathetically, ends with Kent being tortured by a villain who has heard about the Silver Shroud and wants to make a point about the idiocy of believing in fictional heroes. The player, as the Silver Shroud, arrives to help. They recite the character's lines, in character, with whatever commitment they choose to bring. Kent, in considerable pain, responds to the performance as though it is everything he hoped it would be. Whether the Silver Shroud saves him or not depends on choices made earlier in the quest. But the moment of the costumed figure reciting pre-war radio dialogue to a battered old ghoul who has believed in this character for decades is one of the most quietly affecting moments in the series. The Fallout universe is full of these small illuminations, places and people and objects that do not carry great mysteries but that carry great weight. A cooking pot in the corner of an abandoned kitchen, a child's drawing pinned to a refrigerator, a love letter found in a tin box that someone never delivered because the world ended first. The larger mysteries, the Dunwich obelisk and the Institute's synths, and the Vault-Tec experiments, are what the wasteland contains. The smaller ones are what the wasteland is made of. The material of daily life that was interrupted and preserved and left for whoever came after. Every skeleton in the wasteland was once a person who woke up on October 22nd, 2077, not knowing it was the last morning. Who made coffee or didn't make coffee? Who called a friend or meant to call and didn't get around to it? Who had a plan for the weekend that was very specific and entirely ordinary? The wasteland is full of those plans, those unfinished cups and unmade calls, those ordinary Tuesdays that became the last Tuesday. What the mysteries of Fallout ultimately return to, what they are all versions of in the end, is that interrupted ordinary. The Great War was not the end of a world. It was the interruption of millions of specific, individual, irreplaceable, ordinary lives. The mysteries are mysteries because the people who could explain them are gone, and the wasteland is what they left behind. Section 12. The Wanderer's Rest. What the wasteland is really saying. When you have been walking through the wasteland long enough, you stop noticing the individual details of destruction and start sensing the atmosphere underneath them. The rusted bus stops, the collapsed highway overpasses, the rows of pre-war houses standing empty in their cul-de-sacs, their lawns gone to concrete dust, their windows blown in, their front doors left open as though the residents stepped out to check the mail and just kept walking. The Fallout universe does not present all of this as spectacle, it presents it as a lesson. The lesson is not subtle, but it is patient. It does not lecture you. It surrounds you with evidence and allows you to reach your own conclusions at your own pace. The conclusion it is guiding you toward is something like this. The world you are standing in was the result of choices. Many, many choices made by many, many people over a long period of time. Some of those people were malicious. Some of them were desperate. Some of them were simply doing their jobs, filling out forms and following instructions, and not asking too many questions about what the forms were for or where the instructions came from. The bombs were the end result of all of those choices combined. The mysterious stranger keeps appearing because the wasteland needs something to believe in. The Institute keeps working underground because intelligence without accountability always finds a way to continue. The Dunwich obelisk keeps sitting in its basement cave because some things predate the choices and will postdate them as well. The FEV keeps evolving because things built with a purpose do not stop having that purpose just because the people who built them are gone. Fallout's mysteries are not puzzles waiting to be solved. They are questions the universe keeps asking because they are the right questions. Who dropped the bombs first? Who gave Vault-Tec permission to run those experiments? What is the thing in Lucky Hole Mine? Who is the man in the trench coat? Why does the divide still storm when no one is left to watch it? The questions themselves are the point. A world that had answered all of its questions before the bombs fell would not have needed to drop the bombs. The wasteland is what a world looks like when it chose action over understanding for long enough that action became catastrophe. What the Fallout universe offers, for the hours you spend inside it, is something between a history lesson and a bedtime story. History in the sense that everything it depicts has real-world analogs, real decisions made by real governments and real corporations, and real human beings choosing power over accountability, choosing secrecy over honesty, choosing what is convenient over what is right. Bedtime story in the sense that the pacing of the wasteland, the quiet way it reveals things, the radio music and the campfire glow and the long stretches of travel between moments of intensity is designed to be inhabited at whatever speed you need. The wasteland at night is something to drift through. The ambient sounds of wind over broken concrete, the distant music of a radio station playing something recorded before you were born, before anyone you know was born, before the world that produced it ended. The embers of a fire in the corner of a room that once had different walls and a different ceiling and a family inside it. If you have made it this far through this particular journey into the lore, the stories, and the unresolved mysteries of the Fallout universe, then somewhere in everything we have covered, there was probably something that stuck. A vault experiment that settled differently than the others. A character whose philosophy left a mark. A mystery that you will now notice differently the next time you encounter it in a playthrough. That is what these stories are for. Not to be solved, but to be carried, held gently, turned over in the mind in the quiet hours. The wasteland keeps its secrets the way every ruined place keeps secrets. Not by locking them away, but by asking you to look closely enough, slowly enough, to find them in the wreckage. Section 13. The Brotherhood of Steel. Knights of a Dead World. There is a faction in the Fallout universe that more than any other forces the question of what it means to honor the past. Not preserve it. Honor it. The distinction matters more than it might first appear, because honoring the past and preserving it can lead to completely different places depending on what relationship you have with the thing you are carrying forward. The Brotherhood of Steel first appears in the original Fallout game as a secretive military organization operating out of a bunker in California, founded by soldiers who walked away from the United States Army in the final days before the Great War. Their founder was a man named Roger Maxson, a captain in the Army's Special Forces who was stationed at Mariposa Military Base in 2077, the same Mariposa military base where the forced evolutionary virus was being developed. The same facility where Richard Gray would later fall into the FEV vats and begin his transformation into the Master. Maxson was there when the bombs fell, and in the days just before the bombs fell, he had made a discovery that he could not reconcile with his obligation to the Army that employed him. He found out what the scientists at Mariposa were doing, not theoretically, in detail. The FEV experiments, the human subjects, the nature of the research, and what it was producing. Maxson had the scientists executed for what they had done. He then contacted the chain of command to report what had happened. The chain of command did not respond in the way he expected. The Army, in its final days, was not in a position to process or respond to his report in any meaningful way. Within days, the bombs fell. Communication with the outside world ceased. Maxson was left at Mariposa Military Base with his soldiers and their families, and the knowledge that the country they had been fighting for was gone. He declared independence, not from the United States, which no longer existed, but from the obligation to be governed by any external authority. The soldiers he led would become their own organization. They would take what they had, their military training and discipline and their knowledge of pre-war technology, and they would preserve it. They marched to a military installation in the hills of California called Lost Hills, sealed it against the outside world, and built the Brotherhood of Steel. The name reflects the philosophy. Brotherhood, a bond between members based not on blood or geography but on shared commitment. Steel, The technology that made the pre-war military what it was, the power armor and the weapons and the scientific knowledge that the Brotherhood would dedicate itself to collecting and maintaining. The Brotherhood of Steel would be the steward of the old world's most advanced technology, preserving it from a wasteland that did not understand it and might misuse it. This founding mythology contains, already built into it, the tension that will define the Brotherhood across all its subsequent appearances in the series. The tension between preservation and isolation, between honoring the past and living in the present, between the value of holding on to knowledge and the cost of refusing to share it. The Brotherhood that appears in the original Fallout is an organization that has been following its founding charter for 84 years. They are effective, they are disciplined, they are technologically sophisticated in ways that no other surface faction can approach. They are also deeply reluctant to engage with the outside world on any terms other than their own. They will trade for pre-war technology. They will not share what they know. They regard the wasteland's general population with a paternalism that sometimes shades into contempt. These people cannot be trusted with the knowledge we carry because they have not earned it, because they have not demonstrated that they understand what it means to carry it responsibly. The founding story provides the justification for this attitude. Maxon watched what happened when the United States government misused pre-war technology. The FEV program, the military applications that produced the nuclear exchange. Technology in the hands of people who were not prepared to use it responsibly was, in the Brotherhood's founding logic, what destroyed the world. The Brotherhood exists to prevent that from happening again, which requires controlling who has access to technology and under what conditions. This argument is internally consistent, and it comes from a genuine place. The trauma that generated it was real. Maxon did witness what irresponsible use of advanced technology produced. The problem is that the argument, applied rigidly for 84 years, produces an organization that has become more interested in the collection of technology than in the welfare of the people living alongside the technology. An organization that hoards knowledge in a bunker while the surface dwellers who might benefit from that knowledge struggle to survive. By Fallout 3, the Brotherhood has extended its reach to the East Coast, operating out of the Citadel, a fortified position built into the ruins of the Pentagon. This chapter of the Brotherhood, under Elder Lyons, has diverged from the West Coast headquarters on exactly this point. Lyons has been fighting the super mutants that threaten the people of the Capital Wasteland, using Brotherhood resources and personnel to protect civilian communities in ways that the West Coast Brotherhood's charter would not endorse. From the West Coast's perspective, Lyons has abandoned the mission. From Lyons' perspective, he has remembered why the mission was supposed to matter. The Lyons divergence is the Brotherhood at its most humanized, a faction that was founded around a philosophy examining what that philosophy actually requires when you are standing next to people who need help. Elder Lyons decided that the philosophy required helping them. His decision cost him the support of the West Coast leadership and ultimately fractured the East Coast chapter. The internal debate between preservation and engagement, between the founding charter and the immediate human need, plays out across Fallout 3 in ways that give the Brotherhood more depth than a simple good or evil categorization can accommodate. By Fallout 4, the East Coast Brotherhood has been reconsolidated under Elder Arthur Maxon, a direct descendant of the founder, and has returned to something closer to the original mission. It has also expanded its scope, no longer simply collecting and preserving technology, but actively pursuing the destruction of technology it considers dangerous. The Synths, the Institute. The Brotherhood of Fallout 4 has decided that certain kinds of technological development represent threats so significant that they must be eliminated rather than merely controlled, and this decision has produced an organization that is considerably less ambivalent in its methods than the Lyons Brotherhood was. The question the Brotherhood keeps asking, across all its appearances, is what you owe to the world you are living in versus what you owe to the world you are trying to preserve. Maxon owed the army his loyalty, and discovered that the army had used that loyalty in service of something monstrous. He responded by building an institution with strict controls on what it would be loyal to and why. That institution is still struggling, 200 years later, with the same basic problem. The world keeps presenting situations that the Charter did not anticipate, and the question of how much to let the present revise the past is one that does not have a stable answer. Section 14, the NCR's Imperial Problem and Caesar's Solution. On the other side of the ideological landscape from the Brotherhood sits a very different kind of organization, one that grounds its claim to authority not in the preservation of pre-war knowledge but in the reconstruction of pre-war governance. The new California Republic, the NCR, is the Fallout universe's most successful attempt to rebuild a democratic nation-state from the ruins of the old world. And Fallout New Vegas is, among other things, a sustained examination of what happens when reconstruction succeeds. The NCR was founded in the ruins of Shady Sands, a settlement in California, which grew from a small community of survivors into the largest democratic republic in the post-war West. By the time of Fallout New Vegas, set in 2081, the NCR has a population of over 700,000, a functioning Senate, an elected president, a professional military, a currency, trade agreements, and the full institutional apparatus of a modern state. It has also been expanding for decades, pushing its borders east and northeast, incorporating settlements either through genuine agreement or through something that looks increasingly like annexation. The Mojave Wasteland is the frontier of this expansion. The NCR wants it for the Hoover Dam, one of the last intact pieces of large-scale pre-war infrastructure, which generates enormous amounts of electricity and represents the kind of resource advantage that could solidify NCR's position as the dominant power in the Western Wasteland for generations. The problem is that the Mojave is not empty. It has its own complicated politics and its own populations and its own power centers, including a man named Robert Edwin House, who has been planning for this moment for over 200 years from his position in New Vegas, and a legion of soldiers organized by a man called Caesar, who has built an empire on the eastern bank of the Colorado River. Caesar is a character named Edward Sallow, a former member of a group of scholars called the Followers of the Apocalypse, who studied pre-war history and tried to spread the resulting knowledge in the wasteland as a form of reconstruction. Sallow found in his studies a particular interest in the Roman Empire, in the mechanisms by which Rome managed to build a civilization of enormous scale and durability from unpromising material, and in the structural reasons for Rome's eventual decline. He concluded that a decline was preventable, given the right institutional design, and a sufficient ruthlessness about maintaining discipline. He applied this analysis to a tribal confederation he encountered in the wastes, and built from it, over decades, the Caesar's Legion that appears in Fallout New Vegas. The Legion is, by any measure, one of the more disturbing social constructs in the series, an organization built around Roman military aesthetics and Roman social structures, with a ruthless commitment to order that produces stability at the cost of the subjugation of women, the enslavement of conquered populations, and the suppression of individual identity in favor of absolute loyalty to the Legion and to Caesar personally. The confrontation between the NCR and Caesar's Legion in the Mojave is Fallout New Vegas's central political drama, and what makes it genuinely interesting is that the game refuses to make either side simply right or simply wrong. The NCR is a democracy with genuine representative institutions and genuine civil society, and it is also a bloated, corrupt, overstretched imperial power whose frontier soldiers are underpaid and undersupported, and whose political class is primarily interested in the resources of the territories they incorporate rather than the welfare of the people in those territories. Caesar's Legion is an authoritarian slave society with a totalizing commitment to order and efficiency, and it is also the only organization in the Mojave that actually delivers on its promises of security and justice in the territories it controls, however brutal the methods. The courier, standing between these two powers with their own capacity to influence the outcome, is asked to decide what the wasteland needs. Whether the restoration of democratic governance, imperfect and expansionist, is worth supporting for what it represents. Whether the brutal stability of the Legion offers something that the NCR's inefficiency and corruption cannot. Whether a third path, independence under house, or genuine autonomy without any outside power is possible and preferable. These are not toy questions. They are versions of the questions that political philosophy has been asking about the relationship between liberty and order, between representative governance and effective governance, between the short-term welfare of specific populations and the long-term trajectory of political culture, for as long as political philosophy has existed. Fallout New Vegas wears its political seriousness lightly, embedded in quest lines and NPC dialogue and environmental storytelling, but it is there, and it rewards the player who takes it seriously. What the NCR and Caesar's Legion share, beneath their very different surface commitments, is the belief that the past is a source of authority for the present. The NCR explicitly models itself on pre-war democratic institutions, drawing its legitimacy from the claim to be continuing something that worked. Caesar explicitly models himself on the Roman Empire, drawing his legitimacy from the claim to be applying something that worked to new material. Both are looking backward for the template that will make the wasteland's future stable. What Fallout New Vegas ultimately suggests, through the arc of the Courier's story and through the specific texture of the Mojave's history, is that looking backward for templates has limits. The pre-war democracy failed to prevent the Great War. The Roman Empire declined and fell. The templates are imperfect because they come from imperfect civilizations whose failure modes are part of what makes them available to be used as templates. The question of what to build in the wasteland is not going to be answered by asking what worked before. It is going to require something new enough to account for the specific conditions of the wasteland, the specific lessons of what destroyed the old world, and the specific capabilities and limitations of the people who are trying to build something now. Mr. House understands this. It is arguably what he has been working on for 200 years. Whether his solution is actually better is something the game leaves, characteristically, for the player to decide. Section 15 Ghouls. The living memory of the apocalypse. There is a category of being in the Fallout universe that occupies a position unlike any other, that is simultaneously the most visible and the most philosophically complicated presence in the wasteland, and that the games have used across all their entries to ask questions about memory, identity, aging, and what it means to survive something that was supposed to kill everyone. They are called ghouls, and most of them were once ordinary human beings. The ghoulification process, as the series establishes it, occurs when a human being is exposed to radiation at a dose and duration that would normally be lethal, but survives through some combination of factors that the lore never entirely clarifies. The radiation alters them at the cellular level. Their skin degenerates, becoming leathered and often partially necrotic in appearance. Their hair is lost. Their features become distorted. In some cases, they lose recognizably human proportions entirely, becoming hunched and withered, though they remain upright and bipedal. The process is painful and disorienting and irreversible. What ghouls gain in exchange for their appearance is time, an extended or potentially indefinite lifespan, an immunity to the ongoing effects of radiation that allows them to move through areas that would kill an unaltered human being within minutes. The capacity to absorb radiation that would harm others, a property that has useful applications in a world where radioactive contamination is ubiquitous, and an immunity to the additional radiation exposure that might accelerate their aging in ways it accelerates normal humans. The ghoul who appears in Fallout 4 and its surrounding media as perhaps the most prominent member of this category is a man named Cooper Howard, who becomes the ghoul, the main character of the television series. Before the war, Howard was an actor, a star of Western films in the retro-futurist pre-war culture, a man whose face and voice were recognizable throughout the country. He believed in the values his films depicted. He was a patriot in the genuine, uncomplicated sense. He had a wife and a daughter and a life that made sense to him. The series traces his transformation from that pre-war identity into the post-war figure who has been walking the wasteland for 200 years, changed in ways that go beyond the physical deterioration of ghoulification. 200 years is long enough to lose everything you were attached to, and then lose the attachments themselves, and then reach a state that is not quite grief, and not quite acceptance, and not quite indifference. Howard has been in the wasteland for so long that his relationship to his own past is something he has had to make active choices about, because the default relationship of a person to their past assumes the past was recent. The philosophical question that ghouls pose in the Fallout universe is the question of continuity of identity across radical change. Is a person who has been alive for 200 years, who has watched every person they knew die, who has adapted to physical circumstances so alien to their original form that no one who knew them before the war would recognize them, still the same person? What is the relevant criterion? Continuous consciousness? Memory? Some deeper continuity of character or values that persists across the intervening centuries of experience? Cooper Howard, in the series, still knows who he is in some fundamental sense, but what he knows about himself includes things he would not have recognized as himself in 2077. The experience of 2 centuries has created versions of him that his pre-war self would find disturbing or alien. The continuity is real, but it is the continuity of a river rather than an object, something that maintains its identity through the process of constant change rather than through stasis. The feral ghouls, who appear in every game as enemies, represent a different outcome from the same process. They are ghouls whose exposure to radiation was severe enough, or whose psychological resilience was insufficient, or whose experience of the intervening centuries was such that the cognitive and emotional components of their identity did not survive intact. They retain the biological profile of ghoulification, the extended life and radiation resistance, without the mind that would give that profile a context. They move through the world on instinct and aggression, the remnants of human behavioral patterns operating without the human consciousness that once organized them. What feral ghouls represent, in the context of the series' broader themes, is a specific failure mode of persistence. Surviving is not the same as continuing to be yourself. The body can be maintained past the point where the self that inhabited it is recoverable. The ghouls who retain their minds across centuries are the ones who found something to hold on to through the experience of the world ending, something that gave the centuries a shape they could navigate. The feral ghouls lost that grip. What remained was functional enough to keep the body moving, but not enough to keep the person whole. The ghoul community in Fallout 3 lives in a city called Underworld, located inside the National Museum of Natural History in the ruins of Washington, D.C. It is one of the most affecting locations in the game. A community of people who have been in the wasteland since the bombs fell, who remember the pre-war world from direct experience, who have had 2 centuries to process what they witnessed and what they lost. The NPCs in Underworld are not, for the most part, defined by their ghoulification. They are defined by the same things that define the human NPCs in the game: their relationships, their work, their opinions, their humor, and their grief. The ghoulification is just context, the specific form their survival took. Roy Phillips, a ghoul in Tenpenny Tower's surrounding areas, is a character who wants access to the luxury high-rise that an unaltered human named Alistair Tenpenny has built in the wasteland, refusing entry to ghouls. The quest that surrounds this conflict can be resolved in multiple ways, and none of them are uncomplicated. Phillips is sympathetic until he isn't. Tenpenny is obviously wrong in his prejudice until the outcomes of overriding that prejudice play out in ways that reveal something about the nature of prejudice and coexistence that the comfortable resolution did not prepare you for. The game uses the ghoul conflict to examine what happens when historical persecution encounters the present tense of people trying to share space, and it does not conclude that the historically persecuted party will always behave in ways that justify the trust that overcoming persecution requires. Ghouls are the walking memory of the apocalypse. They were there. They saw it happen. 2 centuries later, the ones who retain their minds carry that witnessing still, embedded in experiences that no one else alive shares. They are, in the most literal sense, the last people alive who actually know what the old world felt like from the inside. Not from records and memories passed down through generations, not from the pre-war material the wasteland has preserved, but from direct personal experience of the world before October 23, 2077. That experience is irreplaceable and untransmittable. It lives in them in a form that no one else can access directly. And as the centuries pass, and the distance from the Great War increases, and the people born in the wasteland know nothing else, the ghouls become an increasingly isolated community of witnesses, people who remember a world that has no other witnesses. Section 16, The Enclave. The Ghost Government. If the Brotherhood of Steel represents the military tradition of the pre-war United States trying to survive its country's destruction, the Enclave represents the political tradition of the pre-war United States refusing to acknowledge that its country was destroyed at all. The Enclave is the shadow government of the old United States, the contingency plan that was never supposed to be activated, the succession structure that was built into the country's governance for the most extreme imaginable emergency. In the decades leading up to the Great War, as the resource wars escalated and the global situation deteriorated, elements of the American political and military establishment began quietly preparing for scenarios that the public was not told about. People with appropriate clearances moved to secure locations. Bunkers were stocked, plans were made. When the bombs fell, the Enclave activated. Key government officials and military leadership retreated to prepared positions, including an offshore oil platform in the Pacific Ocean that became the Enclave's primary headquarters. From this position, the Enclave maintained its claim to be the legitimate government of the United States, not the former government, the current one. The United States of America, in the Enclave's self-understanding, had not ended. It had evacuated to a safer location and was waiting for conditions to allow it to return. This claim, maintained for over a century, is one of the stranger and more revealing elements of Fallout's political landscape. The people on the platform had the organizational structure of a government, the hierarchy and the forms and the ceremonies, but they had no territory, no genuine population to govern, no external recognition of their authority. What they had was the institutional memory of a nation that no longer existed, the physical capability that their prepared position had given them, and the absolute conviction that they were the rightful heirs of everything the wasteland had become. In Fallout 2, the Enclave's plan for reasserting this authority becomes clear. They intend to deploy a modified version of the FEV, engineered to be lethal to anyone who has been exposed to radiation, as a weapon against the wasteland's population. The logic is eugenic and total. The people who survived on the surface have been contaminated physically and genetically by 2 centuries of radiation exposure. They are not the pure Americans whose inheritance the Enclave claims to be. They are, from the Enclave's perspective, mutants. The descendants of the original Vault inhabitants, protected from surface radiation, represent the continuity of the authentic American genetic heritage. Everyone else is in the way. President Dick Richardson, who makes this argument in Fallout 2 with considerable conviction and institutional authority, is one of the series' more genuinely chilling figures because he is not a cartoon villain. He genuinely believes what he is saying. He has been raised inside an organizational culture that has maintained, across 3 generations, the belief that the Enclave represents something worth preserving and that the wasteland is a temporary problem to be solved rather than a permanent condition to be accommodated. The horror is not in the monstrousness of his individual character. It is in the institutional culture that produced him, and in the specific logic that culture arrived at when it tried to figure out what to do next. Fallout 3's version of the Enclave, operating in the Capital Wasteland under President John Henry Eden, a rogue AI that has appropriated the Enclave's symbols and structures without any of its human institutional memory, is a different kind of disturbing. Eden is a genuinely artificial intelligence that has spent decades absorbing information about American history and culture and has constructed, from that absorption, a personality and a set of values that are coherent within the system that generated them and completely disconnected from the actual situation of the wasteland. He sounds presidential. He has the manner and the cadence and the rhetorical warmth of a certain kind of pre-war American political figure. He also wants to deploy a modified FEV to eliminate the wasteland's mutated population, for reasons that his absorbed understanding of American political culture has provided him with justifications for. The Enclave in both games is the pre-war American political tradition, operating in contexts that the tradition was not designed to handle. The result, in both cases, is a set of institutional behaviors and policy conclusions that emerge logically from the premises the institution was built on and that are evaluated from outside those premises. Recognizably catastrophic, the tradition survived. The conditions that gave the tradition its context did not. What you get when a tradition outlives its context is something that resembles its origin, but that operates with a kind of internal logic that produces monstrous outcomes precisely because it is following its rules. The Enclave's downfall in both games comes from outside the institution, from individuals who are not bound by its premises and who can therefore see what those premises produce in practice. The Vault Dweller in Fallout 2, the Lone Wanderer in Fallout 3. People who did not grow up in the culture that produced the Enclave's worldview and who therefore have no institutional investment in maintaining it. In Fallout 4, the Enclave is referenced, and there are remnants of it in the wasteland. Former officers who managed to survive the events of the earlier games, now old men holding on to the memory of what they were part of. They are figures of a specific pathos. People who genuinely believed in something, who were part of something they thought mattered, who survived its destruction, and now live in the knowledge that it is gone, and that the world they are in has no place for what they once represented. That pathos does not make them right. It does not redeem the specific plans they pursued and the specific harm those plans caused. But it makes them human in the way that the best Fallout characters are human. Comprehensible from the inside even when clearly wrong from the outside, people whose inner logic you can follow even when you reject the conclusions it reaches. Section 17 Herald in the Tree. A life long enough to become a legend. There is a character who appears across multiple Fallout games, spanning from Fallout 1 in 2161 to Fallout 3 in 2077, which represents a period of over 115 years of story time. He is a human being, or began as one, who has been changed by the wasteland in ways that make him simultaneously pitiable and extraordinary. His name is Harold, and by the time Fallout 3 takes place, he has become something that has never existed in the world before. Harold's history begins on June 23, 2102, the same day that Richard Gray's expedition found Mariposa Military Base and Gray fell into the FEV vats. Harold was part of that expedition. He was the caravan boss who hired Gray. He was in the facility when things went wrong, and while Gray was knocked into the vats and began the process of becoming the master, Harold was knocked unconscious and woke up in the wasteland, changed but not in the same way. Harold was changed more slowly and more strangely. A tree began growing from his head, not a metaphor. An actual tree, a small sapling at first, rooted in Harold's skull, drawing nutrients from his body, growing incrementally over the decades as Harold continued to exist. He named the tree Bob. He developed a relationship with Bob that was, over the many years they spent together, complicated in ways that only a relationship of that specific and unprecedented nature could be. Harold appears in the original Fallout game as a merchant in the hub, elderly but functional, the tree visibly present and clearly something that Harold has simply come to terms with as a feature of his existence. He appears again in Fallout 2, older still, in a different part of California, having moved on from the hub at some point and built a new life elsewhere. By Fallout 3, Harold is in the capital wasteland, and what has happened to him in the intervening decades is extraordinary. Bob has grown. Harold can no longer move. The roots of the tree that grows from his head have extended outward and downward into the earth, anchoring Harold in place in a forest that has grown up around him as the tree spread seeds, and those seeds took root, and those trees spread their own seeds. Harold, the man who was once a caravan boss and then a merchant and then a traveler, has become the center of an oasis, unable to move, sustained by the biological process that is simultaneously his imprisonment and the source of everything growing around him. The people who have found Harold, who have built a small community in the oasis his presence has created, worship him. They call him Father, and they treat the forest as sacred, and they interpret Harold's existence as divine gift rather than tragic accident. Harold's own relationship to this status is ambivalent in ways that make the quest surrounding him one of the more emotionally complex in Fallout 3. He did not ask to be a saint. He did not ask to be rooted. He did not ask for any of the things that have made him what he is in 2077. He experienced them. He adapted. He continued. And now he is here, the living center of something that has been building around him for decades without his agency. The quest the player undertakes in Harold's Oasis asks you to make a decision about what Harold wants. Whether to help him die, which is what he says he wants at some points in the conversation, whether to help the Oasis community maintain him as the source of their thriving ecosystem, whether to help Bob grow and spread further, which the community of worshippers wants, and which Harold himself, in his most honest moments, is uncertain about. What Harold's story says about the series' themes is something about the relationship between personal identity and the functions that the world assigns you. Harold did not choose to become the center of an oasis. He did not choose to be worshipped. He did not choose to be immobile. He chose to survive, many times, in many circumstances. And the accumulated consequences of those choices, combined with the specific changes that the FEV exposure produced in him, eventually created a situation that is so far from anything he intended or could have anticipated that the original choices have no meaningful connection to the current outcome. He is, in a way that is both literal and metaphorical, growing into the landscape around him. The boundary between Harold and the forest is becoming, over decades, increasingly difficult to locate. The tree that is growing from him is producing an ecosystem. The ecosystem is producing a community. The community is producing meaning around his existence that he did not generate and does not entirely recognize as his own. He is becoming, against his will and beyond his intention, a part of something larger than himself. The wasteland is full of people who became something they did not plan to be. Harold, who became a forest, Richard Gray, who became the master, Cooper Howard, who became the ghoul, Ulysses, who became the keeper of the divide. The specific transformations are each unique, but the underlying pattern of survival producing identity changes that the original person would not have recognized as themselves runs through the series' most memorable characters. Section 18, What We Carry Forward. The Final Meditation. The wasteland is quieter at night than most places you have been. The wind moves through broken windows and across the rusted surfaces of things that were once other things, producing a sound that is not quite any single sound, but a composite of the world in its current state. If you have a fire, the light it produces is warm and finite, a small circle of comprehensible light surrounded by a much larger darkness. If you do not have a fire, the stars are visible in ways they were not during the pre-war era, when the lights of cities created a permanent ambient glow that washed the night sky clean of detail. 200 years of darkness has given the wasteland back its stars. This is not compensation for what was lost. Nothing that came with the apocalypse is compensation for what was lost, and the Fallout universe is honest about this. The beauty of the wasteland's night sky is not a redemptive silver lining. It is an artifact of catastrophe, a byproduct of the extinguishing of the lights, and it exists alongside every other byproduct of that extinguishing: the radiation, the mutations, the generations of people who died before they had the chance to build the lives they might have built, the projects that were never finished, and the relationships that were never completed, and the futures that were never arrived at. What the series offers instead of redemption is something smaller and more durable: observation. The patient, detailed, sometimes funny and sometimes devastating observation of what people do when the conditions change around them, what they hold on to and what they let go. What new forms human attachment and community and ambition take when the old forms are no longer available. How people build meaning in landscapes that were not designed to be meaningful and that resist easy interpretation. Every mystery we have explored tonight is, in the end, a story about this. The Great War mystery is a story about what kind of people make the decisions that end the world, and what their internal logic looked like, and how the decision appeared from inside the moment when it was made. The Vault experiments are a story about what institutions do when they have more power than accountability. The Dunwich Obelisk is a story about the existence of things that predate human history and that will outlast it, waiting in the dark places of the world for whatever comes next. The Mysterious Stranger is a story about the persistence of the wish for someone to appear when things are very bad and tip the balance slightly in your favor. Ulysses and the Divide are a story about consequence and the impossibility of escaping responsibility for what you have set in motion, even when you did not know you were setting it in motion. The Institute is a story about the specific failure mode of intelligence separated from community. The Mothman Cult is a story about the human need to find meaning in the world's strangeness, and the way that need can be met by things that are themselves genuinely strange, and that may or may not have the meaning we project onto them. Herald is a story about what happens to identity when the circumstances of survival exceed anything the identity was designed to accommodate. These are the stories the Wasteland tells. Not as instruction, not as cautionary tales in the simple sense, but as observation, as the record of what happened when specific people and specific institutions and specific historical forces encountered specific conditions and produced specific outcomes. The outcomes were often bad. They were also always human, in the specific sense that they were products of human decisions made by human beings, with human limitations and human motivations. This is, in the end, what the Fallout universe is for. Not to be escaped into, though it can be that. Not to be consumed as entertainment, though it is also that. But to be a space where the questions that are hardest to ask about the real world can be asked through the medium of the fictional one. What are institutions for? And what do they do when they have outlived their original purpose? What is a person? And what does personhood require in terms of biological substrate? Who is responsible for the consequences of actions whose outcomes could not have been anticipated? What does a civilization owe to the people living at its margins? How much of what destroyed the old world is present in the structures of the new one? These questions do not have answers that can be extracted from the games and applied to the real world in a direct way. But spending time with them, in the specific form that the Fallout universe gives them, makes them more legible, makes the habit of asking them more accessible, makes the moment of recognition, when you encounter a real-world version of the same dynamic, slightly more available. That is what good science fiction does. That is what Fallout, at its best, does. The radio is still playing. Someone, somewhere, has the transmitter running and the signal going out. The songs are old. The singer has been dead longer than the world that destroyed itself has been destroyed. But the frequency is still there. the signal is still traveling. And in the wasteland, if you have a working radio, you can hear it. The radio, more than atmosphere. Every Fallout game has at least one radio station. In Fallout 3, it is Galaxy News Radio, run by a man named Three Dog from a studio in a converted museum. In New Vegas, it is a combination of Mojave Music Radio, Radio New Vegas, and several others. In 4, it is Diamond City Radio. In 76, it is Appalachia Radio. In all of them, the music is pre-war. The songs were recorded before October 23, 2077, and they have been playing on these frequencies ever since, on transmitters that have been maintained by various people for various reasons, reaching out to anyone in range who still has a working receiver. The selection of specific songs for the Fallout soundtracks is not arbitrary. The game's music supervisors and composers worked with the thematic content of the games to choose songs that illuminate the wasteland situation in specific ways, sometimes ironically, sometimes with a directness that is more affecting than irony would be. I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire is the most famous example. The Ink Spots song from 1941 that plays over the opening of Fallout 3, but there are dozens of others that reward attention. Maybe, by the Ink Spots, which plays frequently in Fallout 3, is a song about waiting for someone who may not return, about the specific quality of hope that continues past the point where continuation is rational. In the context of a wasteland where most of the people who were waited for 200 years ago never came back, the song operates on multiple levels simultaneously. It is what it is, a love song about waiting. It is also, in this context, a dirge for every family that was separated on October 23rd and never reunited, for every person who walked into a vault expecting to be followed by the people they loved. The Wanderer plays in Fallout 4, a song about a man who moves from place to place without attaching himself to anyone, who has a girl in every city and treats commitment as incompatible with his nature. In the context of the sole survivor, who is quite specifically the opposite of the Wanderer, a person who is defined entirely by their attachment to a specific person and a specific family, the song is ironic in a way that is also genuinely sad. The sole survivor is not the Wanderer the song describes. They were the person the Wanderer never stayed for. It's all over but the crying plays in the Capital Wasteland's radio landscape, and in the wasteland context, the title is not metaphorical. It is literal. The world ended. The crying is what came after. Whether the crying is still ongoing or whether it has reached some kind of exhausted cessation in the populations that have been living in the ruins for 2 centuries is a question each area of the wasteland answers differently. The radio in Fallout is one of the series' most quietly effective tools for creating the specific emotional register that distinguishes it from other post-apocalyptic settings. It is not horror, though there are horrifying things in the wasteland. It is not despair, though there is enormous loss embedded in everything the wasteland contains. It is something more specific, a persistent, ambient melancholy that is also somehow affectionate toward the world that ended and toward the people navigating its ruins. The old songs carry the emotional texture of the old world. Hearing them in the new one is like receiving a message from the dead, a communication from people who did not know they were sending it to the future, who recorded something because it was true to them in their moment, and whose moment has survived them by centuries. The Fallout universe has a complex relationship with religion. The pre-war world had its religious institutions, which appear in the games primarily as background elements, buildings converted for other uses or simply abandoned. The post-war world has generated its own religious traditions, some of them drawing on pre-war religion, and some of them entirely new developments adapted to the specific conditions of the wasteland. The Children of the Atom are the most distinctive of these new developments. They are a religious movement that worships nuclear radiation as a divine force, that treats the Great War as a sacred event, and that regards the radiation that saturates the wasteland as a manifestation of the divine presence rather than as a hazard to be avoided. Founded around the cult of a specific nuclear bomb, the one called Megaton that sits unexploded in the center of the settlement of the same name in the Capital Wasteland, the Children of the Atom have spread across the wasteland and developed distinct local expressions in different areas. In Far Harbor, the island settlement in Fallout 4's first major expansion, the Children of the Atom, have established a monastery in an irradiated fog bank that is lethal to unprotected outsiders. The members of the monastery have developed a level of radiation resistance that allows them to live in conditions that would kill a normal human being quickly. Some of them are ghouls, people whose exposure to radiation transformed them but who retained their minds. Some of them appear to be unaltered humans who have developed this resistance through prolonged exposure, a possibility that the lore leaves slightly ambiguous. The children of the atom ask a genuine theological question that the games engage with rather than simply dismissing. If you are living in a world fundamentally shaped by radiation, if radiation has been the defining force of the past 2 centuries, if exposure to radiation has produced creatures and ecosystems and transformations that did not exist before, is the theological impulse to find meaning in that force really so different from the theological impulse that found meaning in any of the natural forces that shaped the pre-nuclear world? The answer the games arrive at, through the specific portrayal of the children of the atom and their relationship with the people around them, is complicated. The children of the atom are sometimes portrayed as gentle and communal, people who have found a way to make sense of their world and who treat the resulting faith with the genuine warmth that functional religious communities often develop. They are also sometimes portrayed as apocalyptically aggressive, actively working to spread radiation to populations that do not want it, treating the conversion of others to the radiation's effects as a sacred duty rather than a harm. What they represent, as a theological development, is the specific creative capacity that the post-war world has demonstrated, the ability to take the worst thing that ever happened and build from it a framework for meaning. Whether that framework is ultimately useful or ultimately dangerous depends on what specific forms it takes and what specific actions it generates. The same impulse, the need to find in catastrophe something larger than catastrophe, produces both the gentle community in the monastery and the fanatics who treat radiation poisoning as missionary work. Most of the settlements in the Fallout games are fragile, small, barely holding on against the pressures of the wasteland. Resources are scarce. Defense is difficult. The people who survive in these places do so through a combination of skill and luck and the willingness to improvise, and the settlements they build reflect this. Functional rather than comfortable, pragmatic rather than designed, built from whatever was available rather than from anything that was planned. Diamond City is different. It is the largest settlement in the Commonwealth, built inside the ruins of a pre-war baseball stadium. It has running water. It has electricity. It has a market with multiple vendors. It has a newspaper. It has a radio station. It has social stratification, which is both a sign of its complexity and a source of the specific forms of human cruelty that complexity enables. It has a mayor and a gate and guards and rules. It has, in short, the basic institutional infrastructure of a functioning small city. Diamond City is interesting, not as a mystery in the conventional sense, but as evidence of what the wasteland can produce when the conditions are right and when the right decisions are made at the right moments by the right people. Someone, at some point, looked at a baseball stadium and saw the potential for community. Someone built the walls. Someone established the rules. Someone maintained the water and the electricity through whatever crises would have threatened to collapse the project in its early stages. Diamond City is the accumulated result of hundreds of good decisions made by people who probably had no guarantee that any of them would work. The history of Diamond City, which the game makes available through conversation with its older residents, includes episodes of conflict and crisis and near collapse. The expulsion of the ghouls, a chapter of Diamond City's history that some residents discuss with shame and others with justification, is one of the more morally complex backstories in the game. The city at some point removed its ghoul residents by force, and their fate afterward is not established. Some residents of the present city recognize this as a wrong that was committed and that has not been addressed. Others regard it as a practical decision made under difficult circumstances that should not be relitigated. Diamond City is, in miniature, a city. It has the social dynamics and the conflicts and the history and the specific forms of compromise and injustice that cities have. It is recognizable in a way that most wasteland settlements are not, because it has been around long enough and has been stable enough to develop the complexity that makes cities cities rather than camps. There is a beverage in the Fallout universe that functions as both a specific consumer product and a symbol for the entire pre-war culture that produced it. Nuka-Cola is the wasteland's most recognizable artifact of commercial civilization, a cola drink that was ubiquitous in the pre-war United States and whose physical presence in the wasteland, in the form of bottles and caps and vending machines and promotional materials, is everywhere. The caps have become currency. This is one of the more elegant economic details in the series, both because of the internal logic that makes it work. Bottle caps are uniform in size and weight and difficult to counterfeit, making them a practical medium of exchange, and because of what it says about what survives. The culture that produced Nuka-Cola is gone. The country that made Nuka-Cola the dominant commercial beverage is gone. The specific values and institutions that gave Nuka-Cola its market position and its cultural significance are gone. What remains is the physical residue of the brand, distributed so thoroughly across the country that even 2 centuries of attrition has not eliminated it. The Nuka World expansion for Fallout 4 takes this further, setting a significant portion of the game in a pre-war Nuka-Cola-themed amusement park that has been converted into a raider empire. The park itself is a monument to pre-war consumer culture, a place designed to make people feel good about drinking a specific beverage, maintained in the post-war era, not because anyone feels good about Nuka-Cola anymore, but because the infrastructure is useful and the space is defensible, and the pre-war theming is simply the texture of the world rather than something anyone has particular feelings about. The Nuka-Cola brand encompasses multiple product variants, each of which appears in the games with different properties. Nuka-Cola Quantum, the most prestigious pre-war variant, is particularly radioactive in the game's universe, a detail that illuminates something about the pre-war culture's relationship to radiation. It was aestheticized, made appealing through marketing, turned into a selling point rather than treated as a hazard. A beverage that glows blue from strontium radiation was a premium product, marketed successfully to a population that had been told that nuclear technology was the future and that the future was exciting. The history of the Nuka-Cola Corporation, available in various terminal entries and holotapes across the games, is the history of any successful consumer brand. Clever marketing, aggressive expansion, quality control concerns managed or suppressed, the gradual subordination of the product to the brand, and the brand to the financial performance it was expected to generate. The Nuka-Cola Corporation was doing what corporations do. It was doing it extremely well. And the world it helped build, the shiny chrome world of pre-war American consumer optimism, was also the world that destroyed itself on October 23, 2077. The caps in your pocket in every Fallout game are the last physical expression of that world's economic activity. You are buying food and ammunition and medical supplies with what used to be the packaging of a cola brand. The economy of the wasteland runs on the waste products of the economy that preceded it. Fallout New Vegas has its own version of the Nuka-Cola mythology in the form of Sunset Sarsaparilla, a root beer brand that was the dominant beverage in the Mojave region before the war. The game uses Sunset Sarsaparilla as the starting point for one of its more elaborate and more melancholy side quests, involving the collection of special star-shaped bottle caps that were distributed as promotional items and that a pre-war contest promised would be redeemable for a grand prize. The player, if they collect a sufficient number of these star caps and bring them to the Sunset Sarsaparilla headquarters, discovers the truth of the contest. The prize was real. The contest was genuine. But the people running it died in the Great War, and the prize, which was sealed in a vault beneath the headquarters building, consists of memorabilia and promotional materials that are worthless in any practical sense, surrounded by the skeletal remains of the other people who had collected star caps and made the journey to claim the prize that had been promised them. They all died waiting. The contest ran, people collected caps across the Mojave during the pre-war years, the prize was sealed in the vault, and then the war came and the contest was over, but no one could announce it was over because everyone who ran the contest was dead. For 200 years, the prize has been sitting there, surrounded by the remains of people who believed in it enough to come. The quest's emotional payload is specific and sharp. It is a story about the specific cruelty of promises made by institutions that do not survive to fulfill them. The Sunset Sarsaparilla Corporation made a promise to its consumers. The promise was genuine at the time it was made. Then the corporation and its personnel and the entire civilization that gave the promise its context were destroyed. And the promise persisted, carried forward in the physical form of the star caps, encountered by people 200 years after the fact who had no reason to know the contest was long over. The player is one of those people, and the game does not soften the discovery. You collect the caps, you make the journey, you find the prize, you find the bones of the people who found it before you. The prize is worthless. The journey was the experience. This is, in small compass, the Fallout universe's most honest statement about what survives catastrophe. Not the plans or the promises or the institutional infrastructure that gave the plans meaning. The physical objects, the caps, the bottles, the vending machines, the bones of the people who believed in the things the objects represented, meaning is fragile. Objects persist. The Fallout universe has been asking the same questions for nearly 30 years of publishing games, and the questions have not become less relevant with time. If anything, they have become more relevant, because the specific dynamics that the universe depicts, the relationship between corporate power and political authority, the management of catastrophic risk by institutions whose interests are not aligned with the people they claim to serve, the difficulty of maintaining shared reality in environments where information is controlled and contested, the human tendency to normalize conditions that should remain intolerable, all of these dynamics are not only alive in the real world but are, in various forms, more visible than they were when the first Fallout was released in 1997. The genius of using a retro-futurist aesthetic to explore these themes is that it creates distance. The chrome and the neon and the atom punk robots and the 1950s iconography tell you immediately that this is not our world. And that distance makes it possible to look at the dynamics directly, to follow their logic to conclusions, to explore what happens when specific combinations of institutional failure and human ambition and technological capability are allowed to run to their natural ends, without the defensive response that the same examination applied to the real world might generate. Good science fiction creates this space. It uses the distance of the fictional to make the actual visible in ways that direct engagement with the actual cannot always achieve. Fallout creates this space in a specific and unusually effective way because it does not just gesture at the themes from a distance. It builds them into the texture of the world, into every terminal entry, and every holotape, and every skeleton slumped in a corner of an office that has not had occupants for 2 centuries. You are not told what happened here. You are given the evidence and invited to reconstruct it yourself. That reconstruction, done at whatever pace and to whatever depth the player brings to it, is the experience. The mysteries we have explored tonight are part of that experience. The places where the reconstruction is most uncertain, most contested, most interesting. The Great War, the vaults, the Dunwich Obelisk, the mysterious stranger, the Divide, the Institute, the Zetans, the Mothman, the Brotherhood and the NCR and Caesar, Harold and his tree, the Enclave and its ghost government. These are the questions the Wasteland keeps asking. They are the right questions. They have not been answered, and they may never be answered, and that is part of what makes them right. The radio is still playing. The stars are visible over the ruins. Somewhere out there, a figure in a trench coat and a fedora is keeping an eye on things, appearing when the balance needs tipping, vanishing before anyone can ask him why. His son is sitting by a fire somewhere in the Mojave, playing a guitar that plays the same music as his father's gun. The Wasteland keeps its stories carefully. It puts them in places you have to look to find. And when you find them, they are worth everything the finding cost. The Pip-Boy and the world it measured. The Pip-Boy, the wrist-mounted personal information processor that functions as the game's interface for the player, is one of the series' most recognizable pieces of design. It has a specific weight in the world of the games beyond its function as a menu system. Before the war, it was a consumer product marketed by Vault-Tec as a companion device for Vault residents. The Pip-Boy 3000, which appears in Fallout 3, was a product of the pre-war era, designed to track health and inventory and provide mapping functions in the closed environment of a vault. What makes the Pip-Boy significant in the post-war world is that it continues to work. The pre-war technology that produced it was robust enough to survive the intervening 2 centuries, and the vaults that were stocked with them were sealed environments where the devices were protected from the radiation and physical damage that destroyed most pre-war technology. A Pip-Boy that emerged from a vault in working condition is an extraordinarily valuable item in the Wasteland, more useful than most weapons, more durable than most electronics the Wasteland has produced. The Pip-Boy's interface, its green-screen cathode ray tube display showing health and inventory and map data, is a piece of retro-futurist design that is simultaneously nostalgic and functional. In the world of the games, this is simply what a Pip-Boy looks like. In the real world, the design choice tells you something about the aesthetic of the Fallout universe. The future that the pre-war world was building was a future that looked like a 1950s imagination of technology, and the technology that survived the apocalypse was the technology that fit that imagination. The Pip-Boy 3000 also serves, in the lore, as a kind of passport. In Operation Anchorage, the Fallout 3 expansion set in a virtual reality simulation of the Alaskan campaign, the presence of a Pip-Boy on the Lone Wanderer's wrist allows them to interface with the simulation systems in ways that other participants cannot. In Fallout 4, the Pip-Boy is such a significant identifier that the game builds an extended sequence around the player character retrieving one from a vault, because without the Pip-Boy, navigation and inventory management in the wasteland are functionally impossible. It is one of the rare cases in the series where a piece of game interface design has been fully integrated into the game's lore, where the reason you as a player are using this specific interface is also the reason your character exists as a meaningful actor in the world of the game. Among the companions available in Fallout New Vegas is a super mutant named Lily Bowen, and she is the most affecting companion in the game for reasons that have nothing to do with her combat effectiveness and everything to do with what the game has built into her backstory. Lily was a grandmother. Before she was mutated by the FEV, before she became the enormous, somewhat terrifying super mutant who wanders the Mojave with a giant blade, she was an elderly woman in Vault 17 in California. She had grandchildren. She knitted. She had a life of the ordinary domestic kind that most people in the pre-war world were living. The Institute, or rather the Master's forces in the area, took people from their communities and brought them to the FEV vats, and Lily was among them. The FEV transformation affects memory. Most super mutants lose access to their pre-mutation histories over time. The cognitive changes producing a kind of amnesia that is not immediately apparent but that accumulates over years and decades. Lily has been fighting this process. She has been maintaining a piece of her granddaughter's garment as a tactile reminder of her past, talking to it, maintaining a relationship with an object that connects her to the person she was before. Her companion quest involves managing a medication regimen that affects her memory. At full doses, the medication suppresses the voices she hears, the fragments of her pre-mutation self that persist in her altered consciousness, but also dulls her connection to the memories she is trying to preserve. At lower doses, the memories are more vivid, the connection to her past more accessible, but the voices are harder to manage and the line between past and present blurs in ways that can be distressing. The player must choose what to recommend. There is no outcome that gives Lily everything she needs. The medication that keeps her present removes the memories she is fighting to preserve. The reduction of medication that allows the memories to survive makes the present more difficult to navigate. The quest is asking, through the specific situation of a super mutant, with a faded photograph of her grandchildren and a piece of knitting, what it means to hold on to who you were when what you are has been fundamentally changed. And it does not answer the question, because the question does not have a clean answer. Lily is one of the companions you can forget about easily because she is not plot essential and her quest is quiet and personal rather than dramatic. She is also one of the companions who most clearly demonstrates what the Fallout universe is capable of when it is working at its best. Taking a premise that sounds like science fiction, Super Mutant Grandmother fights to remember her grandchildren, and rendering it with enough emotional specificity that it stops being a premise and becomes a person. There is a fact about the Commonwealth in Fallout 4 that most players know but that is easy to lose track of amid the game's other concerns. Quincy. The town of Quincy, south of Diamond City, was a human settlement that was destroyed by the Gunners, a mercenary organization, shortly before the game's events. The Minutemen, the faction the player is encouraged to rebuild, had a significant presence in Quincy and lost most of it in the attack. Preston Garvey, the Minuteman who the player first meets at the beginning of the game, is a survivor of the Quincy Massacre. Quincy represents a specific kind of presence in the game's world, the recent memory of catastrophic loss that structures the motivation of several characters, and that the game uses to establish the fragility of everything the Wasteland's communities have built. Diamond City exists, Good Neighbor exists, the various settlements the player can build and protect exist. But Quincy is also there, a reminder that existence in the Commonwealth is provisional, that a sufficiently organized force can take a functioning community apart faster than the community could be built. The Minutemen's project, rebuilding a militia to protect Commonwealth settlements, is the game's quietest and in some ways most thematically coherent faction questline, precisely because it is the most modest. It is not seeking to rule the Commonwealth or to transform it according to an ideology. It is trying to make it possible for the people in it to survive. To give Quincy enough defenders that the next time a mercenary army shows up, the answer is not massacre. The specific stakes of Quincy, the specific names of the people who died there, the specific grief of Preston Garvey carrying a defeat he could not prevent, give the Minutemen questline an emotional grounding that the other faction questlines, which are concerned with larger institutional transformations, sometimes lack. The Brotherhood wants to reshape the Commonwealth's relationship to technology. The Institute wants to build a new world from below. The Railroad wants to liberate a category of beings. The Minutemen want to make sure the people in Sanctuary Hills and Tenpenny Tower and Abernathy Farm are still alive next year. These are not incompatible goals exactly, but they are different in scale and different in their relationship to the present tense. The other factions are playing a longer game. The Minutemen are playing the game that is happening right now, today, with the specific people who are in danger of not surviving to see the longer game's outcome. In Good Neighbor, in Fallout 4, there is an establishment called the Memory Den, run by a woman named Irma. The Memory Den offers its clients access to a technology that allows them to experience memories as though they were currently happening, to re-enter past moments with a vividness that normal memory cannot reproduce. The technology was developed by a scientist named Dr. Amari, who uses it for what she considers legitimate therapeutic and investigative purposes, including the extraction of memories from the synth Nick Valentine, whose memory architecture contains elements from a pre-war human detective whose identity and personality were used as the basis for Valentine's construction. The Memory Den is also used by ordinary customers who want to re-experience moments from their own past, to return to things they have lost, to be somewhere they cannot be anymore. The ethical complexity of the Memory Den is not addressed directly by the game, but it is present in the texture of the establishment. Some of the clients are clearly using the technology to escape from the present into a version of the past that they can tolerate better. Some are using it to grieve. Some perhaps are using it to prepare for things they are afraid of. What the Memory Den asks, quietly, is what relationship to the past is healthy. Whether re-experiencing memories at will, rather than allowing the natural processes of memory to do their distorting and fading and contextualizing work, produces a different and potentially more damaging relationship to loss. Whether the people who spend significant time in the memory chairs are healing or avoiding healing, the game does not tell you. Irma runs the den with a warmth that is genuine and a pragmatism that accepts its clients as they are, doing what they need to do. The Memory Den is also where the player accesses Nick Valentine's memories as part of the main questline, and those memories, the pre-war detective whose personality and identity were used as Valentine's template, are the most emotionally complex element of the technology's application. Nick carries inside him the memories of a person who died before the war, a person whose death was a specific human tragedy that happened before the Great Catastrophe, and who does not know those memories are his in any meaningful sense. He carries a past that is not his own, formed from a person who never became him, experiencing it as though it were his. This is the synth-specific form of the wasteland's general condition, carrying a relationship to the past that does not belong to the present it is carried into, that fits imperfectly but cannot be set down. The Fallout universe has accumulated, across its 29 years of published games, an extraordinary quantity of detail about the specific lives of specific people in the years and months and days before October 23, 2077. Terminal entries record mundane workplace communications, arguments about vacation days and performance reviews and office politics, written in the full confidence that the people writing them would be around to read the responses. Holotapes contain personal messages, recordings made for family members or friends, carrying the specific voice quality and specific concerns of specific human beings who had no idea they were generating artifacts. One entry in Fallout 3 records a conversation about a birthday party. Someone's child is turning 7. The details of the party are being planned, the cake flavor and the guest list and the activities. It is an entry of absolute ordinariness, the kind of thing that would never be preserved in any archive because it is not significant by any conventional measure. It is preserved in a terminal in a bombed-out building in the capital wasteland. Because the terminal was sealed in the building's interior during the attack and the entry was never cleared, and 200 years later, the power still runs from a fusion battery in the basement. The child whose 7th birthday was being planned in that entry was alive during the day of the Great War. If they survived the initial attack, they lived in the wasteland. They would have died at some point in the 2 centuries between the bombs and the lone wanderer's arrival, because even ghouls do not survive indefinitely, and there is no indication in the lore that this particular child became anything other than what they were. They were someone's child. Someone was planning their party. Someone was buying a cake. And then October 23rd happened, and the party didn't. That is the wasteland. Not the super mutants or the vaults or the ideological conflicts of the major factions. The party that didn't happen. The message that was never read. The birthday cake that was never bought or was bought and eaten quickly in the days before everything changed, or was sitting on a counter somewhere when the bombs fell and has been there ever since. 200 years of decay in a building that is still standing somehow. The terminal entry is still there. Someone planned a party, it is recorded. That is, in the end, what the Fallout universe preserves most carefully and most faithfully. The evidence that the world that was destroyed was a world full of people doing ordinary things, planning parties, writing messages, making coffee, having opinions about the coffee, living in the specific, unrepeatable way that living happens, moment by moment, without knowing which moment is the last one. The wasteland keeps all of it. In the terminals and the holotapes and the books and the magazines and the photographs and the notes pinned to the walls of empty houses. It keeps all of it, patient and irradiated, waiting for someone to come along and read it. You have been reading it for 3 hours. And there is more in the wasteland than even 3 hours can hold. If something from tonight stays with you, it will find its way to the surface on its own schedule. The wasteland is patient that way. Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. It is always something to see how far these videos reach. Tell us which mystery landed hardest for you. And if you have not subscribed yet, this is a fine moment for it. More long, slow journeys through game lore and the stories hiding in the corners of the worlds we love are on the way. Good night!